one.
Good morning. We're at the MPO Managed Lanes Toll Lanes Workshop, and welcome everyone this morning. We'll start this morning with our Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And if we could just, I always like to recognize at this meeting a moment of silence for those this year with our Vision Zero efforts who have been lost to traffic accidents and crashes in Hillsborough County. Thank you. So if we can start now with the roll call, please.
Commissioner Kemp.
Here.
Commissioner Hagan. Commissioner Overman.
Here.
Commissioner Smith. Mayor Lott. Councilman Citro.
Here.
Councilman Dingfelder.
Here, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Mayor Ross. Melanie Williams. Gina Evans. Paul Anderson. Joe Wagner.
Here.
Michael Marino.
Here.
Stewart. And Commissioner Miller and Councilman Maniscalco provided excused absences.
I just have one question. We're not making any decisions here today, correct? I mean, so we don't need any kind of quorum.
That's correct. Today is just informational and discussion.
Okay, great. So we can start, and I ended up having some issues, I'll just say. And so let's start today with the FDOT's Managed Lanes program presentation.
If you don't mind, Commissioner, may I just talk very briefly about the goals for today's workshop?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Of course you may.
Well, I wanted to be able to share with our audience just a little bit of background on what we're talking about here in the Tampa Bay area.
Excellent.
So there have been plans to expand the interstate highway system in Tampa Bay, dating back to the early 1990s, and part of that has included express lanes along those corridors. How those express lanes would actually be operated, and would they be tolled, and where would access points be, and would there be transit in parallel with that? All of those questions were to be answered later. And we're now 30 years later, and we're now at the point where we need to start answering some of those questions. So the first express lanes to be built as part of the Tampa Bay Next program, and I'm going to move down to the next slide. So a subset of all the toll facilities in the region is the Tampa Bay Next facilities. And so these are the major roads that our Florida Department of Transportation District Office has been focusing on and would be responsible for managing. The first express lanes in these facilities would be over the Howard Franklin Bridge and in Pinellas County. But the next ones would be on I-275 through the center of Tampa in that West Shore interchange area that you see in red on this map. And then we also have in the long range plan Interstate 4, which you see in purple, that would head over towards Orlando. And then probably after I-4, we'd be looking at I-75, through most of the county, both the northern part of the county and the southern part of the county. So all of that is currently in the long-range plan, but as I said, still a lot of decisions to be made about how those lanes might be operated. And so the last map that I wanted to share with you is what is funded currently in our transportation improvement program. And so here you see highlighted the Howard Franklin Bridge. That is funded for construction. The I-275 section around West Shore District, also funded for construction. I-4, that's still a planning study. So that is not a build phase at this point within the 5-year TIP. And so I'm very, very pleased to be able to share with you that we have some great speakers today coming to us from all across the country and also from Canada. And they have some great experience to share about how lanes like this have been operated in other parts of the country and the world. And so with that, I will turn it over to our next speaker. We're going to hear briefly from Florida DOT from Central Office, which is responsible for developing the Managed Lanes program for the whole state. And so we have Raj Pannaluri, who is our FDOT Arterial Management Engineer, and Allison Stettner with the FDOT Office of Policy Planning, and she is the director there. So I believe they'll have their slides.
If I may, Commissioner Smith, I was having trouble unmuting myself. I had to chat to the organizers to get myself unmuted, but I just want the record to note that I'm present. Thank you.
Thank you.
Same for me as Melanie Williams. I'm present as well.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Gina Evans, good morning.
Okay, we almost have a full house here. Is there anybody else I should just ask at this point? Okay, anybody else who wasn't recognized in the beginning when the roll call was done? Thank you. Okay, looks like we're, I also had trouble getting in. My password changed this morning, so. Go ahead, I'm sorry to interrupt you. So should we start with the FDOT? Beth?
I am getting that started for you.
Okay,
Okay, can you see those slides now?
great. Yes, thank you very much for that overview. And we'll go now to Florida Managed Lanes Policy Overview.
They get started, Beth?
Yes, please, Raj. Just let me know when you'd like me to advance your slides.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you, Beth. Good morning, commissioners and the leadership of the Hillsborough County MPO. First of all, I want to thank you all for the opportunity for Florida DOT to present to you on this topic of managed lanes policy. My name is Raj Pannaluri. I'm the state's connected vehicles, arterials, and managed lanes engineer here in Tallahassee. I work out of the Florida DOT Central Office under the Traffic Engineering and Operations Division. With me, Allison Stettner, the Director of Office of Policy Planning, will be presenting as well. Next slide, Beth. Many of you may know that back in the month of May of this year, Florida DOT Secretary, Mr. Kevin Thibault, has signed the managed lanes policy. And the key aspect of this managed lanes policy is that it provides for safer travel choices, it offers predictable travel times, and really the focus is on prioritizing long distance trips. In other words, we want to look at vehicle eligibility aspects, access control, and congestion management. So the more we read into the policy, which is available on this slide, and we can provide it to you separately as well, clearly the focus is to relieve congestion. In other words, what are the travel options that are available to the motoring public and how best can we address them? So the policy, the key points are that it is flexible. In other words, we work very closely with our district offices, in this case, District 7 in the Tampa Bay region. And we work with the district mainly because districts understand the local needs better than anybody else. So So our goal is to make sure that whatever is in the interest of the local agencies as identified by the district officers will be considered and will be included as a part of this process. Clearly, as I said earlier, vehicle eligibility, separation of access control, and congestion management are the goals. And the reason we think this is important is because at the end of the day, managed lanes policy has very little to do with revenue collection. That is not the point at all. The point is what kind of options can we provide to the motoring public to get the congestion relief going. We'll go to the next slide, Ms. Alden. So as I mentioned a second ago, with the choices that need to be made available to the general public, and the goal clearly is to bypass congestion as much as possible. And that means if we provide that option, we've noticed around the state of Florida that wherever managed lanes have been implemented, people tend to exercise that option and get through the congestion as much as they can. And the point that needs to be made is that while the congestion relief happens, it happens across the board. It is just not in the managed lanes only, because when vehicles from the general purpose lanes move into the managed lanes, obviously the general purpose lanes benefit as well. In other words, the goal is to promote multimodalism. That is a very important aspect of this exercise. It offers drivers a choice to safely bypass congestion, as I was mentioning. It also helps us to improve the traffic flow. I know that vehicle throughput concept is not necessarily a key part of the discussion, but congestion relief eventually pans into the topic as well. And last but not least, ensure that there's an efficient use of roadway capacity and provide innovative travel alternatives to the motoring public. We'll go to the next slide. So what are some of the benefits? I mean, clearly, when we provide drivers with safe travel choices in a managed lane, when operations and maintenance is watched very closely, where the requirements are kept up in shape and form, clearly that provides more predictable travel time. We've learned from experience from other projects of this type that travel time predictability tends to be pretty high, and we always try to monitor these and understand what happens. Reducing fuel consumption is something that typically happens due to short duration trips in that sense. Decreasing air pollution, shall we say, improving air quality is a part of the element too. Supporting transit use, I mean, when the projects are planned and designed, incorporating multimodalism is a part of the discussion as always. We go to the next slide, it's on. So here's a very quick snapshot of where the managed lanes network is in the state of Florida. As of, I would say, a week or 2 weeks ago, there are 80 miles that are already in operation. And as you can see, most of them are in South Florida. There's about 100 miles of managed lanes that are under construction in various parts of the state, particularly in the Central Florida region and South Florida, and of course, in the Tampa Bay area as well. And under consideration, we have 400 miles that are being actively considered by the district offices. We'll go to the next slide, Ms. Alden. With that, I'll go ahead and request Ms. Allison Stettner to take the presentation from here. Allison.
Thank you, Raj, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to participate today and give you some comfort that we are going to continue to listen, and we're working on improving our policy framework so that we can ensure that we're doing our processes in a transparent and equitable fashion. So moving on, next slide. Thank you, Beth. The department is committed to public engagement throughout the entire process. In March of 2020, we updated our policy to commit to using every possible opportunity in the planning, design, construction, and maintenance of transportation facilities and services, using a diverse methods so that we can reach as many people as possible, to align with the community vision, to be strategic for the community and the facility, and to have solutions that are adaptable and developed collaboratively. Next slide. As part of that process, we're developing the Managed Lanes Guidebook. So when the policy was implemented and we are offering more flexibility, recognizing that we cannot build ourselves out of congestion, we developed the Managed Lane Policy, which Raj talked about earlier, and then we started working on a guidebook, which is anticipated publication in 2021. Next slide. Some of the content for the Managed Lanes Guidebook includes how we identify projects, including having that robust public and partner outreach, looking at how we develop projects. Since construction takes a long time, getting those solutions nailed down takes a little bit of time throughout the process, looking at which alternatives, how we manage those managed lanes, design considerations to ensure safety, and then how we will operate and maintain those into the future. Next slide. So additional things to consider is that when we implement managed lanes, we have to go through an extensive rulemaking process. And during this time, we have a required public workshop and public hearing, in addition to the public involvement plan that we will be implementing throughout. In the law and then the rule, we have to consider vehicle eligibility, pricing, and exemptions. So all of that will be open and transparent and available for comment. Next slide. I think we want to kind of cover some of the key takeaways from our thoughts on ensuring that we move forward in a collaborative fashion. We want to tailor the infrastructure to the community, and we want to have an open and collaborative process that looks at holistic approaches to managing congestion that are also flexible so that we can meet our future needs. So we'll follow the process that's consistent in our Managed Lanes Guidebooks. I know that it's not completely available, so but once it is, you'll have the ability to see how we're going, and it'll be consistent throughout the state. Next slide. And I think with that, Raj and I are available to answer any questions you may have.
Are there any questions?
Yes, Councilman Dingfelder.
Sure. Go ahead.
Okay. Thanks to Raj and Allison for joining us today on this important issue. I'm aware that that you guys started these programs down in the South Florida area. I'm not very familiar with the details of how they're operating, but I'm curious about the pricing structure down there, and also any, you mentioned exemptions. Are they just blanket exemptions for a certain class of vehicles? Like I saw one of the pictures showed a school bus, that sort of thing, or are there exemptions available for disadvantaged individuals, either economically or otherwise, disadvantaged folks?
Raj, would you prefer to answer that, or shall I?
Sure. Yeah. Allison, I'll just give a quick response, and then you can add. That would be great too. So thank you so much for that really good question. Yes, indeed. South Florida has had the most experience with the managed lanes up until today. So we learn a lot, and then we use the lessons learned from that initiative and have them in the rest of the state as well. The question itself, on the 95 express lanes in South Florida, it's a dynamic toll system with a maximum toll, as of now, as of knowing what we know, of $10.50. But most facilities use a static toll of 50 cents. But again, this is a topic that needs to be really brainstormed on a facility by facility basis. But the key point that we really want to drive home is that the whole toll setting, when it comes to the flow of funds, clearly it is section 338.166 of the Florida statutes that dictates how the flow of funds is to be implemented for a regional express lanes network. So clearly we are rule driven, we are statutes driven. And as we speak, we're also drafting up rules here at Florida DOT with regard to the type of topics that was just posed, sir. And as soon as these rules come into shape and form, we'll be in a position to have the guidance rolled into the Managed Lanes Guidebook, which Ms. Allison Stettner just referred to. So the goal is obviously the gross revenues would be applied towards operations and maintenance. That's a key part of the equation. And if during the project development process, multimodalism, let's take transit as one example. If that is brought in, then obviously the transit aspects would be covered as a part of the O&M if they were already considered as a part of the initial project effort. So let me hold there and see. Allison, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think that one of the more critical parts of this is how it can provide this envelope for future mobility, including transit services. Now, the code is really hard to tell the difference between any sort of transit vehicle. So all buses are one of those ones that are exempted. So whether it's a transit bus, a school bus, an over-road, interregional bus, those would be all exempt under the way that it is designed today, along with emergency vehicles. And then in South Florida on the I-95 Express, they have exemptions for those registered with commuter services to have different types of HOV type capabilities. So there is a way to tailor it to ensure that we move as many people as possible. And that is the goal of the managed lanes, is to move as many people as we can to get them to their destinations and provide choices for them.
So just as a follow-up though, what I'm not hearing is I think the elephant in the room, which is moving people, but moving people equitably. So if I'm a part of the working poor, but I'm lucky enough to have a car or need a car to travel 20, 30 miles to my job, making minimum wage or whatever, I have to sit in traffic and look over at the express lanes that I can't afford and see people zipping by. And how and why is that equitable, and is that addressed in the rules and the program, et cetera? And we're supposed to be and I'm not talking about the roads in our community that were built with tolls, like the Salmon Expressway. I'm not talking about that, but I'm talking about the interstates that were built with public money and have always been free. So I don't understand the justification of switching that. And I would hope that that within the rules, there's local authority or local ability to provide some exemptions for people that can't afford it. And not to say, hey, you're poor, or you're part of the working poor, you need to go take a bus or some other alternative, because it's not necessarily realistic, and it's not necessarily fair.
If I could, Councilman, you're asking great questions, and those are exactly the kinds of questions that we asked our other speakers to join us from, as I said, from other large cities that already have experience with this, and be able to hear your experience.
I anticipated that we'd have that conversation with the other speakers, but it's the DOT who's going to be implementing. It's the DOT who's going to be implementing this.
Excuse me. Someone has to mute their mic.
Yeah. Anyway, Beth, I appreciate what you're saying, and I know we're going to get to some of these discussions later, but it's the FDOT who's implementing this, and Allison and Raj are nice enough to come in, and I'm sure this is not a novel topic for Tampa Bay. I'm sure it came up in South Florida. They have poor people also. So I'm just wondering how the DOT is addressing this important question of equity.
Sir, I can add just 2 quick points on this. First of all, it's a really good question, great question. Clearly, Florida DOT, anytime we get into any project, right from the PD&D planning stage, clearly these are the type of topics we definitely want to know more about, we want to handle, we want to address them. So quite frankly, today's discussion is also, in my opinion, I'm sure Allison would agree with me, it's a listening session for us too. So we'd like to hear your input. So what you're saying is a note I'm going to definitely take back to our DOT leadership. But one other quick point is our experience shows that anytime a managed lane gets implemented, typically because some traffic tends to move into the managed lanes, all lanes tend to benefit. In other words, we need to look at how the numbers pan out, but in general, experience shows that even the general purpose lanes tend to benefit. So yes, you're absolutely right. How do we get everybody to their destination in the quickest possible time frame? And those are the kind of things we clearly want to brainstorm when we take each project one at a time, because every region is unique, every situation is unique. Even a corridor from point A to point B and point B to point C in the same region could be different too. So these are all definitely very corridor-driven topics, which we can definitely get into as we go forward with the discussion. But we really want to thank you for the thoughtful discussion. Allison, anything?
I just want to say that equity, transportation equity, is one of the 7 goals of the Florida Transportation Plan, and providing equitable solutions and transportation choices for all users is critical. And in our processes as we move forward. So we will be evaluating that as we get closer to decision making to make sure that we consider equity as part of any decision making that we do relating to this. So there's a balancing effect, right? So as Raj says, that when you divert some of the traffic into the managed lanes and offer this transit flexibility of the managed lanes, you can actually move more people and promote a good transit system that would be connecting throughout the community. But there's many options to how we manage those lanes. That's one of the reasons why the policy was adopted, so that we could add that flexibility in considering the values and the norms in each community individually.
Okay. Well,
Councilman Citro? Oh, I'm sorry.
no, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Kemp. I do appreciate it. I look at these lanes, especially from the pictures that you were showing me, Raj, and I do appreciate those pictures. That the express lanes were basically empty while all the other lanes were full of traffic. Here in the city of Tampa, we have over 100,000 people each and every day coming into our downtown core. And these are people from outside of our area. And every day we see an accident that ties up traffic on I-4 and 275 each and every day. With the poles that are separating the express lanes from the regular lanes, if there is a major traffic jam that is cutting off traffic that we see every day, how are people going to be diverted into those lanes so that those lanes can be used? Comma, if there is a major traffic jam, which we see every day, how are these alternative public mass transportation buses going to be rapid when those lanes are tied up? I'll sit back and I'll wait for your answers to that.
Yes, yes, Mr. Citro, thank you. That's another great question. In fact, the reason why the Managed Lanes Guidebook is being developed is also to address precisely the kind of question you just brought up. When we talk about managed lanes, when we talk about the revenues, etc., we talk about operations and maintenance. And by operations and maintenance, we just don't mean painting and putting up the delineators and whatnot. It also goes back to how do we make sure that we address the incidents. So the point you're bringing up goes to the heart of the incident management strategies that we need to have. And as a part of the managed lanes effort, we do everything we can to make sure that we have at least 2 lanes in each direction, preferably. That's the preferred strategy. And the reason for that is, in the event there's an incident, as you rightly pointed out, which happens pretty regularly, unfortunately, then clearly there got to be a way to at least get the law enforcement and get the emergency vehicles in there to take care of issues, clear the traffic, clear the incident, and get traffic back in shape as quickly as possible. So you're absolutely right. Whenever we discuss any project during the planning phase, during the PD&E phase, incident management becomes a very important part of the equation. So yes, when we do this planning study, we make sure we understand the geometry, we look at the options that are available in the event of an incident, we look at the various scenarios. So I guess from a very high level perspective, not going into the corridor level detail at this stage itself, incident management policies will be adopted. We work very closely with the Florida Highway Patrol and law enforcement agencies, so they become aware about what's happening. We bring in our traffic.
Did you want to say something?
Yeah, if I could just suggest, and I think we got a lot of good questions, but I think, and we're going to stay here till the end of all the presentations. I think that the other presentations may provide some context that we can use, and then maybe the questions at the end could be better. You know, once we have all that.
Well, so before. I do have some specific issues or questions or points to make here. And I was waiting for others to, have their opportunity, and it's specific to Florida. And so I'd like to ask those because they're not, I understand doing that, but I'd like to ask specifically to Florida. So first of all, is veterans activated as congestion management? Or, you listed that as one of these toll lanes, these congestion pricing toll lanes. I call them surge pricing, but is that activated yet?
No.
Okay, why not? I feel like I am disturbed that it's been there for a year and nobody understands what it is because it hasn't been activated. And I think if it was activated, I think you'd get the kind of pushback that has certainly come to Miami. So the South Florida area, in order to make those congestion pricing, surge pricing lanes, you didn't ever add any pavement, right? You took what was there and narrowed the lanes and took what was already a public utility that had been paid for by the public, but used and turned it into more lanes, which if you turn it into more lanes, it could have also provided more traffic passage for everyone equitably instead of pricing, setting aside two of those lanes and pricing it. So isn't that the way the South Florida lanes were done?
I think that's a good point. So there's a huge impact when we add lanes, in using the right of way and capacity. And we understand that there is latent demand, which is all those people who want to get onto the roadway who can't right now and are diverted to local streets. So when you add lanes, typically those lanes fill up right away, requiring you to come back and widen the road. So if we continue to do that, we would end up with acres of pavement that would never end, right? Because there's so much demand, so many people want to come into the community and get there in a reasonable fashion, that there's no way to widen your way out of the congestion
but that's exactly what's happening here. Just because you're doing this surge pricing, it is exactly what's happening. You're just adding more lane capacity and you're doing it at the public expense, not at this is not something that the congestion managed lanes are paying for. This is what the public is paying for to get some exclusive use. It is inherently inequitable in what's being done. Whereas HOV lanes, which we've gotten rid of largely, are not inherently inequitable. They have equity and purpose and can serve these same purposes. So I'll say that first. The second is that the managed lanes in South Florida were created in the roadway that was already there. Here we're going to great expense to add these lanes in, but these lanes won't be paid for by the tolling that is going on them, because if they were, it would be, so much money. They're going to be added at the public expense, not at the people who pay this premium price, who can afford to pay this premium price. I'd also, in terms of South Florida, you're saying it's a limit of 1050, but that limit went up way above 1050 because so many people were getting on the lanes, and you were trying to use congestion pricing to limit the number of people getting on them by charging higher and higher and higher. But then in Miami, there's been a major revolt. They approached the legislature and made sure that the legislators heard from them that they couldn't price above 1050. Isn't that true?
Raj, do you want to answer that?
Sure. Yes, absolutely. Yes, ma'am. Your perspective is absolutely brilliant. And I think the one point that
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble understanding you now. You're breaking up.
Oh, okay, nice. That's it. Point making up. Absolutely. In fact, these are my whole consultation process by developing learning the lessons of the.
I don't know. There's still, I don't know if anyone else can understand. I can't understand. I'm so sorry.
So
Commissioner, it sounds like we're having some technical difficulties, and I wanted to ask our technical staff, our IT staff, to coordinate with Raj and see if we can get his audio worked out. And I wanted to suggest again that we do have some great speakers, and there is time set aside on the agenda at the end for board discussion, which I'm really hoping that we would have this active discussion about the issues that need to be addressed in creating a lane management policy that's appropriate for our area. And that's the purpose of today's workshop, for us to brainstorm those things and then to begin a dialogue that will, feed into that decision-making process that Allison was talking about.
Okay. I'll move on the agenda, but I'll just the other thing that I think is really important is that there's always this transit tie that's supposed to promote this for those of us who care deeply about transit. But I'll say that the transit that runs on the interstates is also in an equitable transit situation where it's serving the long distance commuters that use it less and are much more expensive to serve. I'd rather see transit dollars invested in getting local people in walkable communities that are most likely to use the transit at street level and invest there than invest in these lesser used, long-term, expensive, on the interstate projects. And I think here it has been used in a particularly disingenuous way by the T-BARTA project that they have put out in the, fake BRT, which looks like an automated vehicle project for me with automated vehicle lines, I'll just say. So we can just, we'll move on to the next part, but I just think that those things are important to bring up in terms of as we go through the Florida, because I don't want to get lost in everything else. So let's.
I'm sorry, I had one more question for Raj, and now that I see him back, if I may, with your permission.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Raj, thank you. You were breaking up there for a second. With COVID-19, and getting back to the over 100,000 commuters that come into our downtown core each and every day, we have seen a shift, and it's going more to telecommuting. This, with the COVID-19, may go on another 6 months, may go on another year, may go on another 2 years, for all we know. We don't know. And this trend for telecommunicating may go on for another 2 or 3 years. Has that factor been put into your equation on whether or not these are really needed at this time? So let's say 3 years from now, some great technology comes up where we don't need to fund these, because the section in which I'm concerned about is from West Shore to downtown. Ms. Alden said that it's not been funded. So with this new telecommunication that is hit us because of COVID-19, are these lanes really needed at this time?
Sister, can you hear me okay? Can you all hear me okay?
Thank you, Raj.
Thank you. My apologies for the audio situation earlier. I really apologize for that. Great question, Mr. Citro. I think the question you're bringing up goes to the heart of the reason why we need to look at every project individually, the time when it is planned, the overall traffic conditions in that particular corridor, because as I was mentioning earlier, every corridor is unique, every situation is unique. So, and we are at a very, very early stage in the planning process with this discussion. So absolutely, when we get to the project level detail, clearly this is going to be a consideration, not only the origins and destinations on where the traffic begins, where it ends up, the needs of the corridor itself in consultation with the district office. To the larger question, as of now, we're looking at the traffic situation. Yes, traffic did go down, obviously, during the COVID element, but we also noticed that traffic is coming back up. But again, that would be too far of a stretch for me to predict what is going to happen in the near future. So I guess the simplest answer I can offer, sir, is definitely we're going to work with the Hillsborough County region and with the district office before any decisions are made on the type of project, on the facility shape and form that it needs to have. But I think you bring up a really good question. Thank you.
And I just want to add to that. I think that when we do the analysis, that kind of input is important when we're looking at those alternatives that are going to be required as part of the managed lanes guidance.
And Commissioner Smith, you're recognized. I'm just going to, and then after this, we'll close it out and move to the next.
Yes, and thank you. Of course, I agree with the comments about equity from Commissioner Kemp and Councilman Dingfelder, and have said that several times myself in the past. But the question that I just want to make sure I never get answered, I've heard both the FDOT representatives, and I'm hearing some feedback, if everyone could mute. Both the FDOT representatives say at the high level, this claim that managing with cost pricing, it makes the traffic move more efficiently, and that all the lanes benefit. It's just so counterintuitive. I've never had anybody really explain to me. I think if we're going to ever move forward in this, I would like to see some kind of evidence that that really works. Because I mean, when you think about it, you got X number of lanes, say it's 5, and you reduce the traffic on 2 of those lanes by pricing some people out of them, so that to the extent that the 3 lanes that are free are so clogged that people want to get on the fast moving toll lanes. All right, well, there's less people on those lanes. How is that possibly more efficient than allowing everybody on the lanes? How does that move traffic faster for everyone? I can see how it moves faster for the rich people, but how is it a more efficient use of the 5 lanes to reduce traffic on 2 lanes?
That's actually a great segue to our next speaker. You asked exactly the right question.
All right.
How about if we move on to that, and then if you don't feel it's answered, we can re-ask that again.
Thank you.
That's a great, yeah. So we'll move now to the economic, social, and community implications of congestion pricing.
Are we ready?
Can everyone see the
me?
slide?
I can hear and see.
Okay, so greetings from Victoria, British Columbia. And thank you very much for inviting me to Florida. So I have the luxury.
Are you enjoying the weather? Just had to ask.
Well, we have a little bit of, we've had stormy, rainy weather. Probably you would consider it a relief.
I meant the weather in Florida, this little trip you're taking.
Yeah, well, I thank you very much for allowing me to visit a little warm countryside. Okay, so I'm going to give kind of an overview of, and I'm the first to admit I'm an outsider. I do not understand your local conditions. What I do want to, what I can help with maybe is to develop the vocabulary for talking about and thinking about some of these issues. So we're gonna discuss efficiency and fairness and how the implications for managed lanes. So next slide, please. So you know, if you think about, especially at the municipal level, but also at the state level, one of the most valuable assets that governments have are road rights of way. It's a extremely valuable and important resource. And the question that transportation professionals are increasingly asking is, how should they be managed to maximize efficiency and fairness? And you can think about other services that governments supply or that private companies supply. And generally, we don't do it purely on a first-come basis. For example, if you go to a hospital, there's a triage, there's a rating system. The first patient that arrives is not necessarily the first patient that gets dealt with. There's a management system that prioritizes, and that's, you can think of this very valuable asset called road space, and there are some ways to manage it that may be able to extract more value. So that's really what we're talking about, is how to make each square foot of road space work as hard as possible and be as fair as possible. Next slide, please. Okay, so, you know, most people, they never buy a road. They're not really, they only have a vague idea about how these resources, these assets are financed. Most people assume that roads are fully funded by user fees, that the fuel taxes and tolls that people pay fully fund the roads. Now, I don't happen to have.
Excuse me 1 second, Todd. Excuse me 1 second, Beth.
Yeah.
I'm not seeing the slides. I don't know if anybody else is. All I'm seeing is all of our faces. Are you guys seeing the slides?
Yes.
I'm seeing the
Are
slides.
available. If you could look at the little blue snowflake down at the bottom of your control or your menu bar, if you click on the blue snowflake, you should be able to come up, because you've probably minimized the screen that they're sharing, and all you see is the
All right.
the cameras.
If everybody else is seeing it, I'll figure it out. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Okay, so most people assume that roads are fully funded by user fees. I don't happen to have Florida data, but I have US data. That's what this slide shows, the pie graph. And at the national level, about half of all road expenses are financed by general taxes that everybody pays regardless of how they travel. So if Florida is normal, then that's probably about what your road funding is. Now, a lot of that is local funding. It's local funding for local roads, but also because the US federal government hasn't increased fuel taxes in 18 years, and there's been a lot of inflation since then, and vehicles have become more fuel efficient. At the national level, there's an increasing portion of your highway spending is financed by general taxes. So there's a principle economists call it horizontal equity, and that means that everybody should be treated equally. And one of the implications is that for most goods, most of the things that we buy, you should get what you pay for and pay for what you get. That it is, unless there's a specific reason to subsidize a particular service, horizontal equity implies that that the services that you get should be funded by users. It also increases efficiency, efficient pricing, that is charging users for the resources that they use or the services that they use. It encourages people to use those resources more efficiently. So if you if a service is underpriced, that is, you get it regardless of how much you pay, you're likely to use more of it. And with something like roads, where you have the problem of congestion, you pretty much guarantee that you're going to have congestion. If roads are unpriced, under urban conditions, you're almost always going to have congestion. Next slide, please. So there's an efficiency and equity justification for at least considering, for applying pricing where appropriate. Or to put it differently, efficient pricing can be a solution to a lot of your problems. Of course, motorists don't like paying tolls, but unpriced roads are not really free. It's really a choice between paying directly or indirectly for roads. So are you going to pay for the highways through user fees or through general taxes? And there's this efficiency point. Are you going to pay with money or are you going to pay with time? If roads are underpriced, that is, we make it too cheap to drive under urban peak conditions, you're almost guaranteed to have traffic congestion. And so people choose not based on the price, the financial cost, but they make their decisions based on time. And so there are inevitably some trips that people will take if roads are unpriced that they won't take. They would choose some alternative if they're efficiently priced. In addition, high occupancy toll lanes allow motorists to avoid congestion for urban trips. So one way to think of it is, over the course of, say, a month, you might have 10 trips or 20 trips that you would take on the highway. And a few of those are really important. They're very urgent. And you would be happy to pay a premium for that small portion of trips where you're really in a hurry. And so efficient pricing, HOT lanes, give travelers the option of being able to go faster, to avoid congestion when it's really important, when they're willing to pay a premium. Next slide, please. Okay, so a basic economic principle is that prices, that is what you pay for a good, should be equal to the marginal cost, that is the incremental cost of producing that good. This suggests that motorists should repay the costs of expanding roads to accommodate their trips. If you decide you want to take a trip during peak periods, then and you're asking that for the Department of Transportation to expand the roads to accommodate more of your peak period trips, there's an efficiency and an equity justification for saying you should pay for that trip. Now, most people have never gotten involved in the economics of expanding roads, and you could sum it up and say expanding urban highways is expensive. It's very expensive. Millions of dollars go flying through the air as soon as you start expanding highways, and especially every time you have an intersection, you can easily spend 20 or 40 or 60 million dollars just expanding one major highway intersection. So if you do the math, if you calculate what does it cost to expand, to add more lanes and expand intersections on a highway, and how much you would charge, what would be the cost recovery fee for that road, for that additional roadway capacity, you would be charging typically 50 cents to $1 or even $2 per additional vehicle mile. So this very briefly say that if we're going to try, if your community is going to expand highways to accommodate more peak period vehicle trips, you're spending a lot of money, and there's a legitimate justification for saying that some or all of that incremental cost should be charged to users if possible. Next slide, please. There's a paradox here because motorists complain about traffic congestion and they ask your Department of Transportation to expand the highways. But if you do charge the cost recovery fee, it turns out a lot of that demand just disappears. People want roadway expansions as long as somebody else is paying the cost, bearing the cost. But if you ask how many of those peak period trips are you willing to take, if you have to pay 50 cents or $1 or more per mile, an awful lot of those trips just disappear. So it's a paradox. It's a challenge to decision makers how to either convince people to reduce their demand or how to finance these very expensive highway projects when the existing revenues are just enough to cover basic maintenance now, and there really is not a lot of money for expansion. So next slide, please. So one way you could think about it is unmanaged lanes are inefficient. We have this sophisticated vocabulary for talking about overpricing. If somebody is charging you too much money, you say you're ripped off or gypped or cheated or gouged. There's not a similar vocabulary for talking about underpricing. There's no vivid vocabulary for saying you're not charging me enough. And yet unmanaged lanes are essentially that. They're giving away something valuable without a price. And so what happens is if roads are unpriced and you expand them, the additional capacity is soon filled with what we call latent demand, or the additional trips are called generated traffic or induced travel. So think of it this way. When roads are unpriced, traffic volumes increase to the point where congestion becomes the limiting factor. So the roadway congestion maintains equilibrium. It gets bad enough that it discourages some potential peak period trips. If you expand the lanes, within a year or two, you usually get back to the same level of equilibrium. Next slide, please. So this graph kind of illustrates that. The blue line shows that over time, traffic congestion fills that lane. And if you did a projection and you asked how much traffic, how many trips are going to occur on that corridor, and during the growth period, before the roads are expanded, or while the traffic is growing, you would say, oh, there's a whole bunch of people who want to travel on this lane. But what really happens is if you don't expand the capacity, the traffic volume levels off. It reaches equilibrium. The congestion discourages additional trip, and you get that blue line. Now, if you do expand the road and you add a second lane or a third lane or whatever, then you get the red line. You get another growth, another period of growth in traffic volumes until it reaches equilibrium and the congestion limits the additional growth. And so that additional unit of vehicle trips or vehicle travel is called generated traffic. If roads are congested, people shift when they travel or how they travel. They'll shift from driving to public transportation, or they'll choose a different route, or they'll go to a different destination. So there's an extensive body of research on this. I'd be glad to share if anybody's interested in the technical research. But the basic principles are pretty well proven, that if an urban highway is congested and if you add capacity, you do typically get a year or two of reduced traffic congestion, and then that capacity fills up until the congestion itself maintains another level of equilibrium. Next slide, please. You could also say that unmanaged lanes are unfair because, let's say, a bus or other high occupancy vehicle, the passengers are using much less road space. One bus carries the same number of people as three traffic lanes of people in private cars. So it's unfair. You could say it's unfair that people in high occupancy vehicles are delayed by congestion that's really generated, that's caused by those low occupancy vehicles, or you could say space intensive vehicles. So there's, to put it that more, to reframe that in a more positive way, there's a justification for managing roads to favor higher occupancy vehicles, both in terms of horizontal fairness, that the people who are in those vehicles shouldn't be delayed by the congestion that they're not creating, but also because that gives an incentive for some people to shift from driving a low occupancy vehicle to a high occupancy vehicle. So everybody benefits if you can get some people who were going to drive to shift to public transit or to carpools. Next slide, please. So cities around the world are using various managed lanes strategies to extract more economic value from public highways. These include HOV lanes, bus-only lanes or transit-only lanes, and priced lanes of various types. And they integrate, if you want to put them together, you call it high occupancy toll lanes. I like the term decongestion pricing. That is, you have a toll that's higher during peak periods and lower during off-peak periods. And that gives travelers an incentive to avoid adding to that congestion. It allows higher value trips, such as freight vehicles and transit buses and travelers with urgent errands to travel faster. And in doing that, it encourages some people to shift from driving alone to using high occupancy vehicle lanes or high occupancy vehicles. Next slide, please. And managed lanes, if they're integrated with public transit improvements, can do a lot to benefit transit travelers. If buses have their own lane, buses are traveling in an uncongested road, the buses themselves are far more efficient. They can make more trips per hour, and they can carry more passengers, and they give people, discretionary travelers, somebody that owns a car and could take that trip by car, they give them an incentive to shift from driving alone to using public transit. And so that benefits everybody. Now, in order for that to work, you need high quality public transit. So there is a good justification for saying some of the revenue from tolls, from decongestion tolls, could be spent on improving public transit, or to put more generally, that a decongestion pricing or a toll road project should be integrated with public transit improvements and other incentives, what we call transportation demand management or TDM incentives, to encourage people to make those shifts. Everybody benefits. Even the people who never use the public transit can benefit from high quality public transit because it reduces the toll that's required to achieve a vehicle travel or a traffic reduction target. Let's say your goal is to reduce traffic volumes on the highway by 20%. If public transit is inferior, that might require a $4 or $8 toll. But if you have high quality public transit, you could achieve the same vehicle traffic reduction with only a $2 or $4 toll, a much lower toll, because it's easier for some of those travelers to shift mode. You don't have to convince everybody to give up driving, but if you can achieve, say, a 20% mode shift, 20% of people that would have driven are now using public transit, you're reducing traffic congestion for everyone. So the potential is there, but you have to think systematically. Next slide, please. So we actually have quite a bit of experience now around the world with decongestion pricing. There are a number of highway projects in North America, and internationally there are a number of cities that have implemented various versions of decongestion pricing. And there's some really good examples. We don't have time to go into them right now, but one that you might want to investigate is the Stockholm trial project, where they asked the good people of Stockholm, would you like to have road pricing? Would you like to have decongestion pricing? And people at the start were pretty skeptical. There was only about 50% or less than 50% support. And but they said, let's give this a try. Let's try it for 6 months. And they did. And as you'll see in that graph at the bottom, once people experienced it, support for the road pricing, for the decongestion pricing went way up, including by the people that pay the toll, because the motorists that pay the toll experience the benefit of the reduction in congestion. And so you had some people that benefited because their buses were no longer stuck by delayed by congestion, but you also had a bunch of motorists that actually benefited from a toll. They paid money, but they saved time. Next slide, please. So I want to emphasize the managed lanes are just they're one link in a chain between you walking out the door of your house and you arriving at your destination. There are many links in that chain. If you're going to take public transportation, it includes things like walking to the bus stop and waiting for the bus and riding on the bus and walking from the bus stop where you disembark to your destination. All of those are part of the link. Similarly, if you're going to carpool, there are many links in your carpool trip. And if you're going to drive, there are many links. And simply implementing managed lanes only affects a portion of that trip. If you really want to convince people, or you want to encourage people to shift from making, let's say, you want a commuter to shift from driving every day of the week to driving, let's say, 3 days a week and carpooling or using public transit 2 days a week. If that's your goal, you want to think about all of those components. Next slide, please. And the incentives that they face. So you want to think about things like, what's the quality of service? How attractive are the vehicles and stops? How easy is it to get information? What are the fares affordable? Do you have walkable communities and bike share so it's easy to get from the bus stop to your destination? Are there incentives? So employers are offering their employees who use public transit the financial savings that the employer gains from not having to provide parking. So most employers subsidize parking. A fair system says, if I use public transit or I walk or I bicycle, I should get the cash equivalent of what you were spending on subsidies for my coworkers who drive. And if you put all those things together, next slide, you can achieve very large. We have experience showing that you can achieve very large mode shifts, that a 20 or 30 or 40% mode shift is achievable in North American cities if you put all these things together. The best example I can suggest is the city of the city of Seattle. For the last 25 or 30 years, the Washington state law has required large employers in the Puget Sound areas to have a commute trip reduction program. The Washington Department of Transportation has managed lanes, and the region has invested a lot in a high quality public transit. And I should emphasize, most of this is not rail. Most of it is simply incremental improvements in bus service. And if you look at the graph on the right, that is transit and automobile mode shares in Seattle for the last really just about a decade. And they have been able to achieve a very significant mode shift from automobile to public transit and ride sharing over about 12 years through this combination, this integrated program. And it includes managed lanes. Next slide, please. So maybe after all this, you are somewhat persuaded that Tampa Bay could benefit from managed lanes and an integrated program that includes things like improving public transit and commute trip reduction incentives. But you are in the very different, I have the luxury of being an outside expert and I don't have to face the voters, where you are right at the front line. And so your challenge is going to be able to put together an articulate response to the criticisms that you will almost certainly face if you support some of these managed lane and TDM strategies. So if you want, the next, if you are convinced that there are reasons to start managing lanes and you want to look at how to do it, how to maximize the value and the equity benefits, then the next step is to design the system that has that integrated set of components, and to make sure that you can respond to the criticisms that you will almost certainly face by people who don't understand, who may be unfamiliar with some of these issues. Next, and one of the things before you change this, let me point out the third bullet there. There are a number of strategies to address the social equity issues, and one of them is to give either every household in the region or low-income households in the region a few free trips on those managed lanes. So there are ways that you can ensure that if somebody, that low-income people can take some of those urgent trips that they need to take, maybe a certain number of free trips a year or something like that. Those are the kind of strategies that you might need to put into place to address some of the social equity concerns. I also would emphasize that none of this works unless you are significantly improving the quality of your public transit. So that's another thing that you're going to need that you should be discussing. Next slide, please. And so getting back to first principles, the most basic planning principles is that individual short-term decisions should support your strategic long-term goals. So the starting point for you is to make sure that you have clearly defined strategic goals. Things like, do you have a goal, as actually many cities and states now are saying, we want to reduce total vehicle travel per capita, total VMT per capita by 10 or 15 or 20% over the next 15 years. That is the city of, or the whole state of California, Washington State, the city of Seattle, and many other cities now have these VMT reduction goals. And if you did that, then that kind of long-term goal would be an organizing principle for making decisions like HOV lanes and pricing, road pricing, and investments in public transit. And then you could ask, what role will managed lanes play in achieving these goals, and what other policies and planning decisions need to be aligned to achieve those goals? So then you would say, if our goal is to reduce traffic congestion or peak period traffic volumes on this corridor by a certain amount, by a certain percentage over the next so many years, then you wouldn't just be thinking about managed lanes, you would be thinking about managed lanes as part of an integrated program. Okay, so next slide, that's the end of my presentation. There is a lot of information on this, some of it on our website, so if you want more information, you could visit our website, vtpi.org, or send me an email, litman@vtpi.org, and I'll be glad to respond to any specific questions. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to have questions, or we could go on to the next speakers and then have questions after that.
Okay, I don't know. I would have about 40 questions, and I have a very different point of view on so much of what you presented, and I'm very familiar with much of it. But I'm going to see if there's, I know at the last, Commissioner Overman had a question that I didn't permit her to ask at the last, or I didn't recognize her at the last presentation. So I don't know if she would like to ask that now.
Actually, thank you very much. It did actually relate to these specific issues. And what I originally was going to ask is, you know, in the process of FDOT's funding and planning, you know, where in that process do we address actually what Mr. Litman just presented to us when it comes to identifying prioritization of our transportation strategies? So, for example, the process Mr. Litman just described is great. However, in our community, with the lack of transit funding, our citizens don't have transit. I mean, realistically, don't have transit as an option other than being on the road, because our transit agency is so anemic in terms of providing the frequency to allow for the choice of utilizing a high occupancy vehicle. So to address your comments, Mr. Litman, about policy decisions and identifying how to address congestion and managing that occupancy level, or managing that access, or managing the overall challenge of addressing congestion, you know, we do have to kind of back into what policies do we put into place to prioritize that high occupancy strategy, and not only on the government funding level, on the long-term transportation planning level, but also in partnership with private enterprise. When you, for example, when you mentioned employers being required to come up with a strategy to address either their parking vouchers or their transit vouchers. And the reason I was a little more aware of what you just described was when I traveled to Colorado a couple of years ago and spent about a month or so in Colorado, and was using their rail line to get around, their RT, whatever it's called, RTD. And I rode with a gentleman who owned a company of tech folks that basically had his office in downtown Denver, and he refused to pay for their parking spot. But he bought, because it was available through his transit agency, an annual bus voucher. And then with that bus voucher came a waiver program to have Uber or somebody come and pick up a mother or a father that had gotten a phone call that said, "Hi, your kid's sick, you need to come." And you couldn't really facilitate that not on the bus, you know, when it's an emergency, when you need that. So you had a certain number of trips a year that you could utilize in the event that something came up that transit couldn't meet your needs, specifically point to point. But their parking rates in their urban downtown dense area were so high that no one really wanted to park downtown. So it is an integrated approach for private enterprise, but it sounds like we have to at least look at where we can address policies when it comes to that incentive with private enterprise. But more importantly, backing up into prioritizing how our tax dollars that are available for addressing a managed lane process has to go back to where are we trying to go? And as you said, induced demand doesn't solve the problem. Creating more lanes doesn't solve the problem. It solves it for a little while, but not long. So how do we go back to the beginning of this process and say, in our overall funding, how do we prioritize the alternatives, i.e. the bus service, the transit service, the pricing for HOV, and then also make sure that we're doing it from an equitable point of view for those individuals that need that point to point because they're either disabled or just don't have access to the transit service. And if we don't start having that conversation at the policy level and look at prioritizing our transit efforts, for example, HART system, the CSX, because it has less of a congestion problem, access problem, it doesn't get stuck in traffic while we make these adjustments. we're not going to get to this opportunity.
Commissioner Overman, I agree. I think we need to have this discussion, and you're bringing it into a bigger discussion. He doesn't know the local transit system. So, I agree with you in terms of the discussion we need to have for the future. But I don't think he can specifically comment on all that because let
me ask a more specific question. How did Seattle, with your slide that described on success stories, it looks like it took, a lot of years, but how did Seattle decide, or how did they go about developing their transit and single occupancy plan that showed that very positive result?
Right. At the end of this presentation, I will add some links to some newspaper articles about Seattle's success with public transit. Or you could just do a search, an internet search, saying Seattle transit success stories, because in the United States, Seattle is considered the success story of putting all these components together. Let me respond in more general to what I think is the question, is really the root of the questions that have come up. I spend my professional career has really been about critiquing how conventional transportation planning tends to favor faster modes, which generally means automobile travel, faster but more expensive modes over slower but more affordable modes. And for the last 120 years, transportation planning has undervalued walking, bicycling, ride sharing, and public transit. And an associated component of that is a lot of our planning favored urban expansion. You could say sprawl over affordable infill. So there's a long history, and I can lecture on any of these subjects, but we don't have time. So let me what I think is the kernel of this issue is that my research, and I think most planning professionals now will agree that in the planning process, deciding how we're going to spend public dollars, it is far easier to spend money on highways than it is to improve public transit service right now. For the last so many years, that economic analysis and the funding mechanisms have favored automobile travel. And so I do think, let me frame it in a different way. In any community, in a typical community, there are 20 to 40% of people who cannot or should not or prefer not to drive for most of their trips. And so an efficient and equitable transportation system would be willing to invest 20 to 40% of transportation dollars to accommodate non-drivers. That is to invest very significant resources that are not currently being invested in improving walking and bicycling and public transit service. And if you did that, you would have a multimodal transportation system. This particular project or HOV lanes in general are a very small part of creating a more multimodal transportation system, but it is part of it. And it becomes a very large part of it if you emphasize in your planning that simply having HOV lanes or HOT lanes is only half the equation. That equally important is to improve the quality of public transit. So a lot of commuters in Tampa will wake up in the morning and say, I can't wait to get on my bus because my bus commute is the high point of my day.
When you say quality, I just have to ask this. I just feel like there's been a lot of misrepresentation in what you presented, even about the Stockholm story, about the real pushback with the managed lanes in Washington State that got the Secretary of Transportation fired and almost took down a governor. The same thing happened in many of these other places. I feel like this has not been a very fair characterization. Certainly the Seattle transit miracle there, which I have read much about, was not in any way very much helped at all, actually, by the managed lane that came in. And it, like I said, has been under a lot of issues. Stockholm was more of congestion pricing not to go into the city. Same thing with London, which would go to our here, the, I think, ridiculous thing where we're paying Uber and Lyft-like services in our, we're paying them a premium to give people free rides in our cities, the opposite. So you know, to throw the Stockholm in with our interstate, you know, surge pricing, I think is very, you know, just very misrepresenting it. But when you say quality public transit, and I know that you've recently done a whole bunch of automated vehicle work, and, you know, and I have a problem that is they're trying to transfer our transit dollars to that. But when you say high quality, what are you referring to? What makes public transit quality?
Before I go into that, Beth, how much time do we have? I want to make sure that the other speakers get their presentation.
I want to make sure they do too, but I just like, it would just seem like you could answer that quickly if you could.
Sure. Sure. Well, that's what I envision it as I described, that a typical commuter would wake up in the morning and say, I can't wait to get on my bus.
Right, but what does that mean?
It means that the walk between your home and the bus stop is a very pleasant walk or bike ride. That the bus stop is not just a post in the street, that you actually go into your local coffee shop. It's a nice coffee shop. You order some cappuccino, you sit down with your computer, you get some work done. There's a sign on the wall of the coffee shop that shows how many minutes before your bus arrives, or you check your mobile phone and tells you that the bus is coming in 5 minutes, in 2 minutes. When it's 30 seconds, you fold up your notebook, computer, you walk right out, the bus pulls up, you walk onto the bus, you have RFID payment system, so you don't even need to get a change or a card from your wallet. You sit down on the bus, you fold down the little work table.
Okay.
You put your computer
I
there,
get it.
and you have.
May I
I
ask a question?
I'd just like to say for a second that what I didn't hear there was frequency and service. And we can't provide everybody with all those things. You know, I think that to put that out as a vision is a very, you know, serves again. We're talking about equity, and that's not equity, because you're not going to be able to provide those things to everybody. You're just going to provide them to a very small group. And I have problems with inequity in transit. And I think that is, you know, that's reflected there. But I'll let, you know what, I'm going to I had one fast question here, and then we can go to the next speaker. Joe, I'll let you, Citro. Thank you.
Mr. Litman, I think Commissioner Kemp hit on two of the key things, which I think are the most beneficial of a price managed transit facility, and that is fast times and reliable trips. That's really what makes your commute enjoyable. If it's going to be enjoyable, because you get there when you expect to get there, and in comfort, and very reliable. And I think these kind of managed lanes offer that sort of opportunity. Additionally, I think the department is open to discussion in this particular instance, in our local situation, to provide some of that toll revenue. How much is up for discussion, I guess, to actually support the transit service that would be put in those managed lanes, which could eventually mean the trip of people using transit get the same speed and reliability times at a much lower price than the people who are willing to pay the toll or have the need to take their personal vehicle that day. And to me, you put those things together, and we've got a concept, much as you've outlined, in a quarter-based system for commuter-type trips. I sent you I emailed you a couple of links to a concept called bus toll lanes that I'd like you sometime in the future when you get a chance to take a look at and get back to me on. So thank you, sir.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry about that. And I know sorry I didn't see you, Mr. Wagner, in the, it had gone up a little. Mr. Citro, I'll let you ask a fast question.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Kemp. Mr. Litman, thank you very much for your very detailed presentation. I do appreciate it. I'm going to go into a microcosm of what you're talking about, and that is from our West Shore interchange to downtown. It is roughly 7 miles, and there is approximately 5 different exits. If this is used as a mass public transportation express, the working middle class in those neighborhoods that it's passing through are unable to walk up to the interstate and use that bus, that rapid bus. Now, however, if we were to be able to use FDOT's right-of-way for whatever, whether it be steel wheel or rubber wheel, with a designated right-of-way, those working class people that live in this neighborhoods or neighborhoods that this rapid bus is going through with no entrances or exits to get on for these working class people, can then do what you say, go to a coffee shop, get on this designated right of way, and use that to get to work in our downtown hub. Thank you again, Mr. Litman, for your presentation. I just had to make that statement because if we put a bus on the expressway, nobody is going to be able to use it that lives in those neighborhoods. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the point. And it looks like we can really use a big discussion, and I felt like we have not had it for years, about equity, about heart, about how our transit system should be designed. The keep pushing this transit or pushing the managed toll lanes is a transit solution I find to just be not the appropriate place for it to be. But let's move to the next presentation. And I still haven't been able to use my my work laptop that I'm used to using. So Beth, I don't know. Okay, thank you. The use of toll revenue for multimodal capacity in Northern Virginia. Thank you.
Yes, I just wanted to thank Kate Mattice for joining us this morning. Thank you, Kate.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. I'll just wait till things pop up. So I know we've obviously talked a lot about very much a case study is what I'm going to talk about, which is an experience that we've had in Northern Virginia in implementing a combined managed lane and transit and multimodal, including carpool and vanpool program for about the last 3 years. And so if you just jump to the next slide, just to tell a little bit about sort of Northern Virginia. We are the suburbs of Washington, D.C. We are very fortunate. We have an extensive transit system. We both have Metro Rail and VRE commuter rail, as well as 6 bus systems that serve the area. A little bit about who I am, the organization that I represent. I'm with the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission. We basically are the transit commission for Northern Virginia. My board members represent all of the jurisdictions, cities, and counties in Northern Virginia that pay for the WMATA Metro Rail and bus system, as well as we are the co-owners of the Virginia Railway Express commuter rail. As I mentioned, we do have a number of local bus systems as well, so we help them coordinate, work with them on state funding, as well as federal funding. And what I'm going to talk about today, we actually are working with the state in administering what we call the Commuter Choice Program, which is specifically a toll-funded multimodal program that is serving 2 of the managed lane corridors in Northern Virginia. Next slide. So just a little bit of background. Again, if you see on the far right is Washington, D.C. So we, again, are right adjacent to Washington, D.C., the Northern Virginia suburbs. Depending on sort of how wide you go out, it's definitely several million people that are living in that area. We do have a lot of people who do centrally commute and move into Washington, D.C., but we also have job centers in other areas throughout the region. The Commonwealth of Virginia, just like your Florida DOT, VDOT actually manages most of the roads in Northern Virginia. And we do have a long history of HOV lanes. And since 2007, have been taking some of those and turning them into managed lanes. 495, which also people know as the Beltway, that was the first managed lane network that was put in place in 2007. And since that time, the Commonwealth has been moving to add managed lanes on a couple of other interstates within the region. So if you just hop to the next slide, I'm going to focus and talk about the two that are a part of our commuter choice program. And actually, if you can just click your slide, hopefully we'll be able to see, I've got it automated. So first of all, just to pause here for a moment, I-66 inside the Beltway was actually a dedicated HOV2 lane, and it's actually been an HOV-only facility during peak periods for 40 plus years. So this is a really, I will admit, this is a unique situation. This was never general purpose in commute hours. You had to be, in fact, at one point, I believe it was HOV4, but over the last couple of years, it had moved to HOV2. So there was definitely a need and a desire to provide some options for people running through that corridor. And that was basically the first agreement we had with the Commonwealth, was to look at administering a program using toll revenues from that corridor. Now, if we just click to the next corridor, which is relatively new, in fact, it's less than a year old for us, is actually a corridor that's had close to a 50-year HOV presence. And in fact, my agency back in the early 70s ran dedicated buses along their busway on 395. It was called the Shirley Highway Express. So that is a corridor that's had long history of HOV, most recently HOV3. Now that also has general purpose lanes. So unlike 66, this always had general purpose lanes. And then there's a median that was HOV3 inbound in the morning, likewise in the afternoon. So in 2019, that actually HOV facility went hot, as we'll call it, which basically turned into a toll revenue, a tolled facility that still, if you were HOV3, you went for free. Obviously, all transit buses go for free. Van pools go for free. But if you're a single occupancy vehicle, you would have the option to pay. In both of these situations, we have an agreement, actually a multi-decade agreement with the Commonwealth to administer a multimodal program that I'm going to dive into next. So the Commuter Choice Program, as I mentioned, is an agreement that NVTC has with the Commonwealth of Virginia to accept a portion of the toll revenues from both of those facilities to run a competitive program that will provide multimodal solutions to the corridor. And when I say multimodal, it's really about anything from expanding transit service, which could be existing routes and adding more frequency service on that, or even starting up new transit routes. It can be some roadway improvements, whether it be ITS or other information that could help movers move through that corridor. Access to transit. Now, one of the things, again, we do have the benefit of Metro Rail and VRE. So if we have ways to get people onto those services, whether they be bike share or shuttles or those sorts of things, those are considered eligible, as well as direct incentives to carpoolers and van poolers and transit riders. So it's intended to be a sort of a holistic approach that would combine with the tolled facility to provide a variety of options. Now, getting a little bit into the nuts and bolts of how this works, we are a transit commission. We are basically in agreement with the Commonwealth of Virginia to run this, but it is a competition, and the recipients are actually the local governments and transit agencies. So they actually send in proposals and effectively compete for these funds. On an annual basis, we're hoping to move to 2-year basis. Again, we're just about 3 years in or so. So just a little bit about what we've done to make sure that that competition is done with a lens that meets the goals of the program. If you see just right across here, the top, those are goals of the program that were mutually agreed to by the Commonwealth and my commission. So it really is projects that can move the most people, help reduce congestion and provide travel options, really enhance transportation choices and improving transit service. And another thing that's not specifically on here, but I'm going to talk about, is also there was a great deal of concern of diversion through the local neighborhoods, especially on 66. So that is a part of our evaluation criteria, is making sure that the parallel roadways don't also get congested. So go to the next slide. So just very quickly, and I could spend a ton of time, but we do have a technical evaluation process with those applications that come in. This is something that, again, we were guided by the agreement we have with the Commonwealth, but this is something that the Commission went through public comment and had vetted. And again, this is really about how we score these projects. What do we value? How do they meet our goals? And so as you can see, there's a big part of this is about person throughput, saving the travel time of those people who are on that service, providing those connections, diversion mitigation, as I mentioned, and accessibility. And if I could, talking about accessibility in this sense is actually about getting people from a job center to where they live to job centers. So it's basically, are we taking advantage of where people are needing to go to, again, during these commuting hours, because that's when we're talking about tolling. We'd obviously looked at cost effectiveness, and then also because we have multiple jurisdictions that can maybe send in 10 applications, we do want to know what their individual priority is. And again, we've got 6 different bus systems and counties and cities. Did they talk to their neighbors when they submitted their proposal? So next slide. So as I mentioned, we're about 3 years in on commuter choice for 66. We're a year in for commuter choice on 395. And so what we've been able to do is actually fund an incredibly diverse set of projects throughout the district. I heard a little bit of conversation about some of those neighborhoods that are actually within the corridors. We've actually supported some fantastic parallel route express bus services that are parallel to some of those corridors that are being put together. For example, in the city of Alexandria, they got several routes that are running through those neighborhoods, but providing very high quality service, again, along that corridor. Just go to the next slide. So when we look at I-66, again, this is a program that we've had in place for 3 years. And in that time, we've been able to invest just over $40 million. A fair amount of that are things that are still being realized. Those are new bus purchases, they're park and ride lots and those sorts of things. But we also have the eligibility within the program to pay for transit operations. So for I-66 Commuter Choice Program, we've actually been able to start 9 new express bus routes. That's something that in our region, there are a lot of folks who are in outer suburbs wanting to get into sort of the DC area. So those are actually filling up very quickly. They're a very popular service. But we've also been able to add service to bus routes both inside the corridor as well as outside the corridor, making them more frequent service. We have helped support a park and ride lot, again, that's supporting some of this bus service. Helped, again, alongside the corridor, making better bus stops. Something I remember that Mr. Litman mentioned was actually having bus stops that are ADA accessible and are really making a difference in getting people on and desiring to take the bus. Those, again, were actually done within Arlington County, which is all parallel to that corridor. We help support Capital Bike Share, which is our local bike share, getting that set up for a community that wanted to get to Metro, as well as provided direct incentives for carpools and van pools. That's another great way to take advantage. Carpools and van pools are free on our tolled corridors. And so if we can get more people into carpools or into van pools, that's a fantastic way to move more people through the corridor. And also we have helped with some traveler information in big office buildings, putting in TV screens that give the next bus information. Again, something like Mr. Litman was just talking about. Now moving to the next slide is 395, and we're barely a year in. As I mentioned before, this is a corridor that's got close to 50 years of HOV. It has a very, very strong HOV3 carpooling, casual carpooling, or slugging as we call it here. There's a huge culture of people already sharing rides with complete strangers. Don't even ask me. I actually have been involved in that space too, and I know it's very hard for others to understand, but it's been remarkable at moving people through the corridor with very little public investment. Well, along this corridor, it's also a fantastic corridor for bus routes. We've been able just in this first year to start up 8 new or expanding service on bus routes. Again, some of them local, some of them long haul. And then we've also supported getting a lot of traveler information. Specifically in this case was focused on, we have a lot of military presence in the Northern Virginia area, both in the Pentagon and at a number of bases just south of our region. So this was basically helping get that information out to folks who move into the area, brand into the area, so they can learn about some of the travel options on the corridor. So next slide. So as I mentioned, super early on, so these are very, very early data. But I think one of the things that's been very key for 66, and that's the data on the left side, is within about less than a year of the corridor being open, they were already seeing more people moving through the corridor in less vehicles, which was very important, and it is important. So the idea being is if you can move more people, less vehicles, less congestion, and in this case, lower tolls. That's a very key thing. Now, the performance data, as I mentioned, super early on, for those, when you look at especially new bus services, the first 2 years, usually 2 to 3 years to really get things ramping up. So these are very conservative numbers, but we also already know for a fact that, again, prior to COVID, we had able to move 1,500 people each morning through the corridor just on our investments, never mind all the other transit and other options that are moving through. And likewise on 395, we were moving 700 people each morning through the investments that we put in. Again, characteristics and of our community is actually on 66. We've seen a 26% growth in the use of bus ridership. So again, that's something we needed. There was demand. We were able to supply and meet that demand. Next slide, please. So it is tough. We are in all in sort of surreal environments, and that definitely has not been lost on what's happening on our corridors. In fact, in Northern Virginia, even compared to the rest of the state of Virginia, VMT is still very low. We do have a lot of folks, particularly because we have a high tech industry as well as a high federal government, that we do have a lot of folks like myself who are still continuing to work from home. Our children's schools are still almost all virtual. So there's also that change in demand for people being able to move into the office. So indeed, we have seen a change in what this means for moving people, but also, which goes with managed lanes, which is also about revenue. And so we do have an impact on the revenue that is available to us for the program. I-66 in particular, it is a very short route. It is primarily a commuter route that is a peak period toll only. And so we have seen huge losses. In fact, taking the entire fiscal year, we saw a 40% drop in revenues. And then of course, that's primarily in the last quarter. So we are looking at a severely reduced program. We had anticipated $15 million going into this fall. And we basically have just put forward a program that's less than $4 million. Again, part of that is being conservative, matching demand when that comes back on, but it's also knowing that we have definite loss in revenues. For 395/95, that corridor is actually a 24-hour tolled facility, but it is one direction. So it's sort of northbound in the morning, southbound in the afternoon. But the corridor itself is 37 miles, and so there's a little bit more cushion in terms of revenues. So we're still working. That is actually a P3. So we're still working with the private concessionaire to see if they can meet their financial commitments to us. So we have a little bit sort of watch this space. But again, the characteristics of these two corridors have led to different types of revenue outcomes. So I just wanted to put that there. And then finally, just to put this in there on the next slide. So this is a partnership that my organization has with the Commonwealth of Virginia. They specifically wanted a multimodal program. They wanted it for many decades. They wanted us to have goals, a competitive program, and they wanted to ensure that we were, providing adequate oversight and administration of the program, including, I should mention, we fund projects, especially when it comes to transit operations, if they don't show that they are continuing to provide, meeting their goals in 2 years, they cannot come back for more funding. So there's a review cycle in a lot of this, and that actually then does involve some staffing support. So we have approximately 3 FTE who are dedicated to this program. We have a technical consultant firm that helps us with the evaluation and the effective management of it. Because again, the agreement we have with the Commonwealth has expectations of analysis, of public comment, obviously very good financial management. It goes through my board, and then it goes to the Commonwealth's Transportation Board for approval. And so I did want to say that it's not, you can't do something for nothing. There is actually administrative support associated with this program, but that's something what we've been able to use some of the toll revenues for. So I'm going to wrap up here if you want to just move to the next slide, and just sort of my final thoughts. What we found in Northern Virginia, the holistic integrated approach, Commonwealth deciding to do managed tolls and have it very closely aligned with options for the community was very important. having a local body like our commission being involved in the evaluation, selection, public comment made it a lot closer to the community. Sounds likewise what you're talking about, having the MPO and the state working together. Having a competitive metric-based program does give confidence that those tools are being used wisely. And of course, obviously, oversight and performance reporting really make sure that we stay our eyes on the prize and meeting the goals of the program. Depending on how the managed lanes work, whether they're 100%, they're only, during peak periods, what have you, it does affect the toll revenues. It does affect the kind of projects that may benefit from this. And then likewise, and I didn't even talk about it before, communication with the public, what these toll revenues are being used for, how they're helping the community is a huge part of this as well. So I'm happy to take any questions now or after we're all done.
Okay. Are there questions?
Yes. Commissioner, if I may?
Sure.
Thank you. Wonderful presentation, Ms. Mattice. I do appreciate it. Just one quick question. How did you get the VDOT to sign an agreement to fund your grant program? I see you laughing. I know how hard it is, so I wanted to hear from you.
Oh, well, no, that's a fantastic question. And first of all, it was over 5 years ago, and we've been in operation for 3 years. So we'll just keep that in mind. In fact, actually, this was a very strong negotiation, a lot of time, a lot of energy. A big part of it is that there was recognition in the governor's office and with the Virginia Department of Transportation officials that a lot of local buy-in was necessary. And a way to do that was to use a transit commission. And so that partnership, which is, big memorandum of agreements, has already been amended 3 times, was a big part of getting local buy-in on what they were going to be doing. That was primarily initially with 66. So that was a big part of their compromise, I guess you could say, in looking at taking what had been a strictly HOV facility and making it an HOV plus toll option.
How much skin in the game did you have to put in? Meaning, what percentage of this grant were you guys paying yourself? Let me rephrase that.
Yeah.
Okay. When you got the grant, how much of your own money was put forward for this project?
Absolutely none.
Really? Congratulations to you.
So indeed, so we're not getting 100% of the revenues. I think it's very important. There's a waterfall chart. And in terms of the revenues, Virginia Department of Transportation, especially for 66, I think that's one I can give because it's 3 years. So they are using the revenues to pay for the maintenance of the facility itself. So that's your repaving, your plowing, your police, as well as all of the tolling infrastructure. And so that is the first. We actually, what's not mentioned in here is these toll revenues are also potentially going to be used for some major passenger rail improvements. And so once those get going, there's going to be some dedicated funding, dedicated revenues specifically for paying off bonds for debt service. And then we have a payout schedule. So again, we're third on the waterfall. Right now we're number 2 because those rail investments are important, but they just haven't been realized yet. They're still in the works. And so we have a minimum of 15 million a year when there's more than $15 million in revenues. And we basically have a 40-year agreement. And so it's a 15 million plus a 2.5% escalation each year.
Thank you, Ms. Mattice. Thank you, Commissioner.
Is there anyone else with questions?
Yeah, I have
Commissioner Smith?
Dingfelder has a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. I have her in the text and then I'll go to you, Councilman Dingfelder. Commissioner Smith?
Okay, just 2 quick questions. I think, first of all, you mentioned slugging. It sounds like that's hitchhiking. What is that and how does that work?
Yeah, it's definitely, so one of the things historically, and this is especially on that 395 corridor, as I mentioned, that had, from 50 years ago, that was a dedicated bus lane. And it basically was primarily serving the Pentagon. So the Pentagon is a major employer. It still is. It's also a major transit hub for the region. We have, dozens and dozens of buses as well as metro routes going from the Pentagon. And so back 30 years ago or so, when it was moved to being an HOV facility, I believe it was HOV4 facility, and there was an organic process, which was there were park and ride lots that were built, and people meet at those park and ride lots. And I've been a driver, I know how to do this. You go by and you basically say, Pentagon, I'll take 3. And everybody piles in the car and you drive up. It's not unique to the Washington, D.C. area. I do know the San Francisco Bay Area does that as well. The incentive out there was actually HOV was free on the Bay Bridge. And so that was a financial incentive back in the day. But for us, it was very much an access because the 395 corridor has been a very, very congested corridor. And so it is dynamic ride share, you could say, but it's very organic and it's based on at park and ride lots. And so that's something we're actually trying to get encouraged along the 66 corridor as well, is taking advantage of park and ride lots. You never take one person, you're always taking 2 or 3, and there's safety in numbers.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable.
Right. Interesting. Very interesting. The other question is, I have seen some examples of tolled facilities that don't even pay for their tolling structure and systems. And here, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're talking about tolls coming. Are the tolls from these systems funding transit, or did you arrange for the transit to be funded at the same time? Because if people in your area have an understanding that it's important to fund transit if you're going to make this other managed lane system work.
So in terms of, we had new transit ready to go the day the lanes were managed. So we did an advanced call for projects and evaluation, and a part of our agreement was that we basically submitted projects for a certain amount of money. It was the first year they actually gave us an advanced funding of $10 million. We submitted, and we had those projects ready to go the day that tolling started. And that was a big part of this arrangement, was a very clear understanding that this is a part of a holistic, integrated approach.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Councilman Dingfelder?
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, I want to thank Todd and Kate for joining us. It's been informative. Kate, my daughter, lives in DC proper near the baseball stadium, but her husband commutes out, which is kind of interesting. So I'm familiar with some of what you're talking about. But my question today is more directed to Secretary Gwynn, who I see joined us, and we appreciate it, as well as Allison and Raj. I was thinking about this equity issue, which has bothered me for at least a decade. And then I was thinking, if going back to I think what Raj was originally explaining to us, that we have a limited amount of resource, and we have to figure out how to equitably share that resource in terms of lanes and traffic. And then I was thinking about back in World War II. So in World War II, we had a limited amount of gas, and we rationed that gas with coupons. And supposedly, I know people cheated, but supposedly everybody got the same amount of gas coupons, no matter if they were rich or poor. And that's the way it was supposed to work. And it seems like, at least on design, that was a fair approach. And I was wondering why we couldn't do that on this system. Why we couldn't allocate to all drivers a limited number of trips on those express or managed lanes or whatever we want to call them. And then to address the folks that I'm very concerned about, the very poor are not driving. The transportation disadvantaged are not driving. So that's not really an issue per se. But in terms of the working poor, or in our region, we've got retirees on fixed incomes, and they're never going to jump over into those lanes, and we have a lot of them. So what I was thinking about is why not try and figure out a way to allocate to all drivers a limited number of trips. Some people would pay for those. If they want to use them, they would pay for them. And then the working poor perhaps could qualify for subsidies and not pay for them. But at the end of the day, everybody would have access to those ration coupons, obviously computerized, and everybody could at least feel like they're not always in that congested lane looking over at the rich people driving by. So, David, I don't know if that's something that you guys have talked about, thought about as an alternative, but I sure would like to, Raj and Allison were saying that we can experiment locally, and I'd like to, propose that maybe that's an alternative. I don't know if anybody's tried that around the world, Todd or Beth, if you're aware of that. But I don't know. I just thought of it perhaps as a viable thing. The other concern I had, Todd, or I don't know who was talking about it, Todd or Kate, about Stockholm, is when I think of Stockholm, I think of more of a homogeneous population in terms of demographics and earnings. I don't think they have the disparity of income that we have in the United States, and specifically in Florida and Tampa. So even though certain things might work elsewhere, like a lovely place like Stockholm, which my son visited recently, I'm not sure that would jump over here. Anyway, just a thought. Mr. Gwynn, do you have any response to my suggestion?
Well, let me, I think there was a number of questions in there, so I'll try real quick to cover them quickly. So one thing I'd like to point out, you heard about the transit investments from the toll lanes. That's entirely our intent. In fact, in South Florida, we fund a regional transit system in the express lanes that carries more people per day than the whole Sunrail system. It's very, very successful. And so the intent would be not to use the tolls to pay off the road construction. That's not our intent. That's covered under other things. We use it to maintain the equipment on the system, and then to provide transit opportunities on the system as well. The equity issues that you bring up, I can say right now there's no mechanism in the state we have to provide for instance, vouchers or coupons, things like that. It's not to say that it couldn't be in the future. Right now, there's not really an avenue for that. But as we develop our tolling strategy, especially for instance, in the West Shore area, we're still quite a number of years away from where we have to finalize that because we won't have traffic in that network for probably 10 years. And so we have time for those types of opportunities to evolve. But right now we do not have, that's not part of our plan. Whether it should or should not, that's a discussion we could continue to have over the next, number of years. But right now we don't have a mechanism to do that. But our hope also is to, I heard about, well, people don't want to walk up on the interstate to get on the bus, and I get all that. We're looking at a regional system, not a local system when we're talking about the interstate. We're not proposing, although local bus routes could use it if they found it made sense for them. That's more for your regional transit that would tie in, for instance, at the West Shore Intermodal Center, that would tie the local to the regional. And all of that starts to build the network. The problem isn't that we don't have good transit. We don't have a connected transit network. We don't have ways to make sure that you can connect where you want to go. And so the regional network would hopefully then feed into a lot of other local systems that FDOT, we're putting a ton of money into studies for these BRTs and other systems that would tie into this type of network. So it's all one part of a puzzle. No magic answer for all of it, but we're willing to consider everything, but we can't really commit at this point to providing that type of a treatment.
And
Hopefully that answers your question.
Right. Mr. Green, just to follow on Pat. David, I recognize, I just threw that out there as an idea for today, and I recognize that the implementation is probably 10 years away. But I also recognize that, maybe we could be an innovator. Even if we can't find that system anywhere in the world, maybe we can be the innovator in hiring a consultant who could develop a system like that. Because I can assure you that right now, the description of the Miami system and some of the other systems that I've read about really do not address the real equities. And when you say, well, we can, and Kate, with all due respect, when you say, well, we can fund the transit system. Our transit system is, as the chairman and others have pointed out, our transit system is horrific, and we have so far to go. People need to drive.
I appreciate all this. We need to have more discussion, but we do also have one more presenter.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought that was the end of the presenter.
Because I just don't want this. We need to get to the last presenter. And I just like to make a fast comment because I come from the DC area. I have a big family that all lives around it. So more than decades ago, my brother who commutes in picked up slugs when I was in the car, his regular slugs. And then sometimes, people were sick, vacations, whatever else. So I'm very familiar with that. But the other thing, I just think it's important to point out when we're talking about equities, and I very much thought your presentation, I'm very familiar with the lanes there, all the way around the Beltway, in between the metro, everything else. But I just like, I think for people to know that, as I understand it, the managed lanes, 10 miles, because they actually are doing, and I think that they also had to cap off what was being charged there, which I understand is for 10 miles during peak period is going about $34. So that in a day, if you use those 10 miles back and forth, you'd be paying $70 in the congestion price lanes. And I'd read quite a bit as I was following that, and that people were getting very angry that it was going to $70 and whatever. So they capped it at $35. Is that accurate?
So again, we're obviously, we weren't involved in the decision on the tolling. The information that I've been provided by VDOT, it's less than 1% has ever paid anything over $30. It was previously a restricted HOV2 only facility, and now people can pay to get on it. And I think that was, it's a very different, I think, than what you guys are talking about. And that's why the transit options and the incentive, telling people all you need is one more person, your spouse, your child, taking him to daycare, and you can actually go for free on the facility. So the number of people who are actually paying those types of tolls are very, very, very small percentage.
Okay, that's good. I appreciate that information. And I think we really need to do much more about HOV. To me, that would be the way to appropriately and properly and equitably use these lanes to the best advantage. But I know there's been quite a bit of, I've read all over the country about how these lanes have gone. So that's just in terms of the lane tolls. So let's move to the next presentation. Thank you from Los Angeles. We have Mark Linsenmayer. Sorry to have you go for so long.
No worries, it's been entertaining. Yes, I'm with the Los Angeles County Metropolitan Transportation Authority. And I'll just start out by saying we're a little bit unique in Los Angeles County simply because we're the planner, designer, builder, funder, and operator of not only the express lanes and the highway system in Los Angeles County, but also the Metropolitan regional bus and rail systems. So we have a lot of different modalities under our umbrella. And we try to make them as interoperable as possible, providing mode choice across all those different systems. So I'll start with showing a quick map of what we have for express lanes, if we can go over. So right now I operate two segments, two corridors, east and west on Interstate 10 and north and south on Interstate 110. Each of them are about 10 or 11 miles. I run about 60,000 trips across those express lanes daily, about 15 to 20 million passengers a year, trips a year, I should say. We're expanding the network. I-105 coming out of Los Angeles International Airport, sort of east and west on the bottom of the map, is under development right now, and we have plans to expand the 10 further east, the 605 connecting some of our different corridors, as well as Interstate 405, which hopefully will be completed in time for the 2028 Olympic Games. At least that's our plan as it goes into UCLA and the Athletes Village there. As I mentioned, our scale is a little bit different at times. We have about 10 million residents in Los Angeles County. So if we were a pure DOT, we represent about the 10th largest state in the nation. Actually, I think it's up to 8 or 9 now. So what we perform and what we undertake in Los Angeles County is a little bit specialized, I guess, is the best way to say it. If we want to go to the next slide, I'll keep moving. We have a number of different program goals, but I think the one that resonates the most with us on a daily basis is to provide a safe, reliable, and predictable commute for customers of the express lanes. And that's really our primary mission is that trip reliability and making sure that, sort of what we promise the vehicles is what gets delivered on a day-to-day basis. Since we also manage the transit side of transportation in Los Angeles County, our other goal is to increase the vehicle occupancy rate, so person throughput on those corridors. And of course, the pricing helps, as Todd mentioned, to encourage transit ridership. And I think that's another important component, is that we're not just simply seeking people to be out of the single occupancy vehicles into HOVs, but also to look at transit as a viable alternative. On a day-to-day basis, we seek to provide excellent customer service. That's both through our express lane service as well as the delivery of the on-road experience. Importantly, we use dynamic pricing as I think does Kate, to help manage our traffic and optimize throughput in the corridor. I'll talk a little bit about some of our thresholds on that in a second, but it's an important component of what we do. The other piece is we operate and maintain a self-sustaining express lanes program. The 10 and the 110 were developed under a federal grant, so we don't have capital expenses to pay down on it, but we do seek to maintain not only the operations of the express lanes, but also fund transit along the corridor, help support some active transportation initiatives, as well as some of the local municipal operators in that corridor through our transit revenue grants. And that speaks to utilizing our toll revenue for corridor improvements and system expansion. And so, not only do we seek to make those improvements throughout the corridor, but also have a longer range plan to expand the network beyond the current two corridors. Next slide, please. And this is just a quick cross section, sort of looking at how we built our system, right? So we typically have 3 or 4 lanes in the general purpose, including oftentimes an auxiliary lane, which Caltrans, our local partner in District 7, encourage us to not only have those auxiliary lanes for loading and offloading on the shoulder ramps, but also to accommodate weaving lanes as cars come in and out of the express lanes in certain areas. As I mentioned, it's all dynamically priced. We have an off-peak floor of 10 cents per mile. During the peak, that's a 35-cent per mile minimum, which has been in place for about the last 6 months or so, as you might imagine. Our ceiling for peak occupancy or for peak periods is $2.10 per mile. So I think I mentioned our corridors are 10, 11, 12 miles long each. So our peak pricing is between $22 and $24 for the entire trip during that time. And we do have the ability to adjust that on a quarterly basis based on, what we call density, which is the number of vehicles per mile per hour on the corridor. So we do make adjustments to that as needed. We haven't needed to this year. So next slide, please. Talking a little bit more directly about the equity and fairness, and this is some of the philosophical components that we look at. One of the things that we look at going into this is that free roads subsidize driving, right? There's no cost component, as Todd mentioned. And the wealthy in turn drive and therefore benefit the most from this free roads piece of it. We think the transportation disadvantaged are more likely to take transit than drive. At least that's what our surveys and research has shown in Los Angeles County. And by transportation disadvantaged, we really mean folks, households that don't have a vehicle or have only one vehicle, but a number of working age people in there, or people going to school, other appointments that would ideally have more than one vehicle. So they are forced into taking transit at times. Our road pricing really keeps transit moving. All of our regional studies and regional analysis, both through our MPO and through our local research, has shown that increased travel speeds and increased expansion of the express lanes network helps our transit keep moving. We do have BRT that we fund and support in our express lanes. As you can see from this picture, we also have median running rail along some of our corridors. So when we look at the modeling of this, if our roadways are congested, our transit slows down, our headways start to fail, and we really have a lot of gridlock throughout our entire system, bus, rail, and on the highways, and importantly on our arterials. And we also think that the road users benefit from free roads, while nearby non-users deal with those generalized costs, right? So when we talk about equity, we're not just talking about folks that are on the roadway, but also the neighborhoods that we're cutting through, and they deal with pollution, noise, reduced safety, and reduced mobility. And then these bullet points here were taken from an article produced by Dr. Michael Manville at UCLA, who's obviously right in our backyard. And one of the things that he says too is that one of the greatest sins you can do, I'm paraphrasing of course, is keep disadvantaged communities trapped in a cycle of congestion. And if we don't do something about it, including what he would describe as helping to price and manage these roadways, we're really doing a greater disservice to those communities by trapping them in these never-ending cycles. And so we continue to look at ways to develop this and help this, including with some of the low-income programs that we have developed as a result of our express lanes. We can go to the next slide. And this is just a quick recap, and I want to show on the left here sort of the transponder that we use to help manage our accounts and help manage our HOV declarations. It's been a challenge working with our transponder and in the physical declarations that we have. We do rely on the users to report to us whether they're traveling as single occupants or HOV2 or HOV3. We do have CHP enforcement, California Highway Patrol enforcement zones and areas, but we also have very dense and very space-constricted roadways, so it's oftentimes hard for them to pull over and for them to find safe places to patrol those express lanes. So it's a hard task to do. We're investing in an occupancy detection system, which will help us with that. But right now, we primarily rely on user declarations. Sometimes we get as much as 20 to 25 to 30% misdeclarations. So people that will suggest are accidentally keeping their transponder at HOV2 or HOV3 when really they're in single occupancy vehicles. So we do have some, I've heard people call them cheaters, but we just say misdeclaration on that. So it's a difficulty to continue to enforce that. That's why we're looking to new technologies to help us with that. But again, looking at how we use the system, we try to take the revenues and make sure that the people that are bearing the cost of these roads are also receiving a lion's share of the benefits. The generalized cost, as I mentioned, go to those surrounding communities that should receive the benefits. And again, we characterize it as some sort of benevolence, but it's also state law. So I guess our state legislators are benevolent. So all the revenue that we get out of the corridor stay within 3 miles of that corridor for different transit and mobility improvements. And our revenues stay focused on those transportation investments. We can go to the next slide. Most specifically talking about our low income assistance plan. When we developed it, it was certainly unique. We obviously had help from some of our consulting experts on this. And it's really a fairly modest nudge that we think has good results. And I'll get into some of the analysis on that in a couple slides. But right now, when people open up a new account and get that transponder, we ask for $40 and a credit card. For our low income assistance program, we then rebate them $25. So they get $40 worth of toll credits for $15. It's a one-time benefit that they get. We do waive the $1 per month monthly maintenance fee, which again is a small amount. It's $12 a year, $1 per month, but they don't have to pay it. And that's really the extent of what we do. And a lot of it is to ensure that our algorithm and our throughput on the corridors are working effectively. And if we provide too many incentives to too many groups, too many exemptions for that, our algorithm starts to break down and we start to lose some of the characteristics of free-flowing traffic that we seek to have. The qualifications for our low-income assistance plan are fairly simple. You must be a Los Angeles County resident and your household income should be equal to or less than the amount shown in the table, which are generally twice the 2020 federal poverty level for Los Angeles County. So we do have a fairly broad use of the system. And if we go to the next slide, I can talk about some of the numbers for that. Right now, we have about 17,000 account holders that are in our low-income assistance program that have paid that $40 and then get the $25 credit and have their account fee, maintenance fee waived. You can see that we've had steady growth in it. Our express lanes became operational in 2013. So starting with that first year, we had about 5,000 users in the program, and it's grown fairly steadily. This chart obviously just goes through 2018, but I can tell you it grew a little bit in 2019, and we've obviously stabilized it in 2020. Not too many people begging us to get into the program at this point. The map on the right of the screen is just a GIS, sort of point map showing where most of our low-income account plans originate. The two black lines obviously represent the express lanes corridors, and then we sort of identify where along those corridors our low-income account holders reside, or at least represent to us where they reside. And this is not that surprising. Both along these high-use corridors, we have a lot of low-income communities, and they're also the ones that try to access longer distance trips. So it's an interesting map, but I'm not sure it shows us any surprising areas. We do have some transportation and transit deserts within this, where we think that there's a lot of people that are forced into driving because they're transit poor, as they would say. But for the most part, we try to track where everybody's coming from and how they're using our system. We can go to the next slide. In addition to the low-income plan, which again, I would characterize that as a gentle nudge, sort of using some economic tools to get people introduced into our express lanes for a lower fee of entry. We also provide transit rewards, which we think also works pretty well on both the 10 and the 110. And as I mentioned, we do fund BRT in those median lanes. We do have stops in the freeways for some of those that are elevated express lanes. So it's a little bit easier for people to access them, kind of coming up into the freeway system. It's interesting, but it seems to work for us. But the transit rewards, kind of tie our express lane accounts to our tap cards. And our tap cards are just the device that we use to pay for our bus and rail trips, right? So they use a tap card, just an RFID card to gain access onto the transit. If they take 16 trips they get a $5 toll credit. And again, this goes back to something that Todd had mentioned about, sort of those emergency trips or high value trips, right? They might take the bus most days, but occasionally they have an appointment, they have somebody they need to pick up, they need to go to the airport, they have a higher value for that trip, or they maybe can't take transit for it. So we provide some incentive for them to use our express lanes with a toll credit. And they can build this up over, I think it's 90 days before it starts to run, run off. So again, it's effective in the sense that for emergencies and for certain trips that they'll want to use the express lanes rather than rely solely on transit. And within that in mind, we were constantly tweaking this. I think we started evaluating it at 24 trips. 16 trips is, just over a week of back and forth. So it's under 2 weeks of back and forth. When we open the 105, there's discussion certainly looking at it as 8 to 10 trips to earn that credit. But again, the credit helps us to sort of continue to price the express lanes and make sure there's a value associated with it without having an oversized impact in either our pricing algorithm or the number of users on it. We also provide a carpool loyalty program, which is just for some of those HOV2 users that feel they no longer get the same benefit they did when they were unpriced. Although our HOV2s are obviously still free, we do provide a monthly drawing for, again, toll credits to those users that are registered on that side of it. And in the state of California, of course, we provide clean air vehicle discounts. They used to ride for free. Again, as electric vehicles were gaining traction, our board decided to change that policy and have now provided them with a 15% discount off the posted toll rate. So for any registered clean air vehicle for electric vehicles and the zero emission vehicles that are registered in the state of California, they get 15% off. They also have to be registered with our program as well, of course. Next slide. And this just talks briefly about where we reinvest some of our net toll revenues. Net toll is obviously after operations and maintenance expenses have been taken care of, and in the future capital and then O&M. 40% by design goes into additional transit purposes. The purchase of new vehicles on our BRT, our center line running BRT, which is called the Silver Line. The additional fare subsidy programs that are in those corridors for schools or employers or rideshare, what we call TMOs, Transportation Management Organizations, and for station enhancements along those corridors that can either be directly owned by Metro or other entities. 40% then go to system connectivity or active transportation, sort of the complete streets, active transportation side of things. Bicycle infrastructure, we have a nice little picture of some bike lockers here, and any first mile, last mile connections. And in Los Angeles, again, too, LA Metro also owns a bike share program, and we also do a micro mobility program, which is sort of an on-demand, smaller transit system that we currently offer in another pilot program. And then 20% to roadway improvements, and this primarily goes back to our state DOT, Caltrans District 7, but it can go to other entities that are doing arterial improvements or ITS system improvements along the corridor, either in conjunction with Caltrans or in support of the arterial system. Signal synchronization and incident management, including in Los Angeles County, our freeway services patrol, which is the tow trucks for big rigs and breakdown vehicles to help with incident management. Next slide. And I think this is my last slide, but this talks a little bit about the program analysis, as I mentioned, as we nudge the low-income assistance users into our express lanes and how they utilize the express lanes as part of this system, right? So right now, like I said, we have about 17,000 low-income account holders. They take about 17 trips per year for each account, which is comparable to sort of our standard account holders. Once we correct that for income and average vehicle miles traveled. It's pretty much the same or similar to our standard account holders, which is just our non-low income users. Or we do make some accommodations for non-rev vehicles, emergency vehicles and transit vehicles and carpools. But for our standard account holders, they travel at about the same rate at the SOV, so that the paid rate that the low income plan users do. Where the difference is the low income users do use our lanes much more frequently for HOV2s and HOV3s. And overall, they're more than twice as frequent users than our standardized or corrected number of account holders, and nearly twice as many as the raw data is on this too. So we do see good utilization, good use, and good support for our low income plan. I think it's been pretty effective overall for equity pieces of this system. And then I think that's all I have. Is there another slide? No, that's it. Happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you so much for that presentation. So we have a little bit of time left here, and questions.
Quick question from Dingfelder.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Mark. So it looks like, and I'm very impressed with your various programs, because it looks like you guys have been trying to be creative for many, many years in terms of the equity issues. I'm a little bit skeptical, maybe you are too, in regard to the low income, what do you call them, LIAP folks. And I'm just wondering how you verify that in fact they are low income. Is there any verification at all? That's my first question. My second question is in regard to the subsidy, that $25 costs $40 to get the pass, and you give the subsidy of $25. It sort of is a nice feel good, but other than that, I mean, it doesn't seem like there's not a whole lot more in the way of subsidy. So I guess what I'm wondering about is if you don't have income verification, maybe you could or should, or maybe we could or should. I'm not telling you how to do your program, but I guess how we could do our program. And B, if we have income verification, then maybe we would have a greater subsidy than just the $25.
Yeah, I mean, the subsidies work for us. We do have income verification. We ask for either a check stub, a public benefit stub, a Medi-Cal, proof of Medi-Cal in the state of California, our Medicare system, tax return. We ask for LAUSD, our school district, lunch recipient families, and different lifeline programs that we have in the county to help verify that. So those are some of the income verifications that we have, and it's usually based off the account holder and that physical address to continue with that proof. Yeah, and for sure there's issues with it, but we think it works pretty well.
So well that's good. Then the next question is why haven't y'all been more aggressive in terms of giving a greater subsidy? I think I heard you say, well, you don't want to flood the system, flood those lanes with users, but it seems like $25 is just such a drop in the bucket.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of reasons, sort of in the academic theoretical exercises to it, but for the most part, we think it works pretty well. We do, as I think Kate and Todd both mentioned, we do offer free travel adjacent to all of our roadways, and I think even to when we were talking with Raj and Allison, And so there's certainly benefits to taking the express lanes during those peak periods, but certainly off peak to change the travel demand model, to look at it from the arterial perspective and congestion in the corridor. Again, one of our goals is to reduce VMT. So we're trying not to create incentives for people to drive, but rather look at each trip and what the value of that trip is. And so to look at alternatives besides single occupancy vehicles, we're already asking a lot of low income families to own a vehicle, to pay for maintenance, to pay for insurance. And then if we're now asking them additionally to pay for these trips, is that really the incentive we're trying to provide to them? When there are alternatives, either through HOVs or through transit, which again, our transit system is for lack of better words, fairly robust in terms of its reach in Los Angeles County. The quality piece of it that Todd mentioned might get questioned by some, but certainly in terms of its reach and its breadth, it's a pretty productive system. And so we're not necessarily trying to provide more ways for people to travel in single occupancy vehicles, but more people to gain mobility in those corridors.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Are there other questions?
Commissioner Smith,
Yes.
quick question.
ahead.
Thank you. Great presentation. All the presentations have been very, very interesting. I like this idea of having some way to address equity and let everyone ride at some level. And I was curious about the revenue reinvestment targets that you have for using the money that's collected from the tolls. So 40% for transit, 40% for system connectivity, and then 20% for roadway improvements. Just thinking about this for our system as we move forward, I just want to, put out there the idea that occurs to me is, we would be paying for the costs of the tolling system on top of this, and then the funds from this get spent on these transit and connectivity, complete streets projects and stuff, but a certain amount gets skimmed off the top to pay for the tolling structure itself. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on the cost benefits of how that the money that's spent on transit and connectivity gets filtered through this, so some is removed to pay for the tolling system.
Yeah, so these are our net toll revenue programs, right? So it's after our operations and maintenance on the express lane. So whether we have toll revenue bonds or just the typical operations and maintenance for our back office and roadside systems, this is all the money that's after that. So it's sort of the bottom line revenue is then spent back into the communities and onto those corridors through those different programs.
Do you have a substantial amount left over after you've paid for the tolling system itself to fund these other?
It depends what you consider substantial. Yeah, I mean, we typically have somewhere between $30 and $40 million a year in I hate to call it excess, but net toll revenues that can be invested in that. I think in one of the earlier presentations, there was a discussion about how those monies are spent and, similar sort of grant programs like that in terms of use. And we have had a number of different grant programs where people apply to receive those funds. And, we haven't seen them spending the money on the projects in a timely way. So we've had to extend some of our deadlines and keep renewing those. So we have had challenges in the corridor. And again, as we keep rolling these net toll revenue programs out within a 3-mile window of that corridor, I don't know if it's a problem of success, but we start running out of good viable projects to continue to fund in that corridor. And it's not that we have an excess of money to spend on it. It's just that there's a limit to the projects and the availability and how many bike lockers you can put in one neighborhood.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? I guess I just have a general, I don't see any others. My chat went down and I'm not sure why. So I have a general, oh, we have public comment also. I see Beth. Or I'm sorry, FDOT perspectives on the next step. I would have a general comment to make with regards to hearing this and FDOT. But with Mr. Linsenmayer, I mean, I think at the beginning, and this has to do with overall the comments also made by Secretary Gwynn earlier. You talked about the local impacts on communities, which we're feeling harshly here with the road widenings through the urban areas. And you talked about the costs, which are there for pollution and noise, reduced safety, reduced mobility. Often, actually, these expressways act as barriers in the interstate in my neighborhood, so that they did away with the grid. So we can't access in the way that we have, and we do have all these other impacts. And then you talked about those kind of being paid off, and I think Secretary Gwynn did too, by this regional. Basically funding regional trips, which is not, most transit trips are under 4 miles. They're not done on the expressways. It's not really the needs for people in these neighborhoods that are here. And we do have, and I know the speakers would know this, but we have the most underfunded transit system in the nation, not by a little bit, but by a long shot, equivalent here in Hillsborough County and with Hart. To Sheboygan, Wisconsin. For us not to be investing in our local street grade level transit and building walkable communities and doing that, I feel like it's a double taking from our communities to be talking about this transit investment, to be in the regional interstate through the community. So not only are we getting impacted by these roads being driven through our communities, but also not even getting any benefits at all. And this is almost a double, I find it to be a double concern in my mind, that we have another impact that we're not benefiting by at all. And in fact, it's doing the opposite. And again, just serving those constituencies that are being served by the roads going through the neighborhood. So I'll just say that and then open it up for any other, Secretary Gwynn, your thoughts about this or whatever. Mm-hmm.
Commissioner, I think there's several ways to look at this, and we all know that there's not one thing that we can do that's going to immediately turn transit around, and all of a sudden everybody has great transit and they get around and it's a robust network. Building blocks. It's going to take the county, it's going to take the cities, it's going to take the state. We're all going to work together. But when you talk about the local transit, one of the things that really could help generate a lot more local transit usage is if you had a regional transit system that brought people to that local transit system. And a good example, I mentioned the express lanes down in South Florida. When those express routes existed prior to the express lanes, when they were allowed to use the express lanes, ridership jumped almost 300%. And those folks then went into the local transit network because it's very unlikely that they stopped right at where they were ending up in when they got to the end point of the express system. So I think there are going to be benefits related to transit, as something like this would allow for regional transit. Now, I'm not going to say that the person that wants to go a half a mile or a mile or 2 miles is going to jump on this regional network. That's probably not going to happen. But perhaps the person in St. Pete or in Wesley Chapel that wants to get to somewhere in the urban core that can get to downtown on a system to tie into the local network, well, then you're driving revenues up on the local system as well. So I think there are benefits. What I have heard today, and maybe I'm not sure I've heard this monolithically across everybody, but it didn't seem like the concerns were related to the managed lanes themselves, but more related to equity and how equity is applied to the managed lanes. And I'll admit right now, we do not have something in our toolbox that allows us to say if somebody makes less than a certain amount or has some sort of a something that we may consider that they should be treated in an equity issue. But that doesn't mean that someday we won't. Right now, the future looking forward for us is next year, we're going to start the process of determining the tolling strategies, and it'll be a public participation process in Pinellas County. So we'll start to develop what is the right tolling strategy in Pinellas County. Probably about 2 years from now, we'll start looking at that same strategy for the Howard Franklin Bridge. And then probably, we're not sure exactly when yet, but probably at least another 6 or 7 years, we'll start looking at the system as it comes into Hillsborough County. So I understand your concerns. We're going to take that back as the Managed Lanes Handbook is developed and our policies evolve. We'll consider all this. But I do think that managed lanes will provide some benefits. I know there's also going to be people that complain about them, but I think overall, there will be a lot of benefits by having the managed lanes as part of our system.
Hey, Secretary Gwen, I just have one question in regard to what you just said, and I don't mean to sound too critical, but it seems to me that shouldn't we have a unified approach across the bay on this tolling issue? In other words, I understand you're building it in Pinellas, and then you're coming on the Howard Franklin, and then you're coming into Tampa, but wouldn't it make more sense for both sides of the bay to have a unified discussion on this?
Well,
we all talk about, being one bay and one unified area and region and all that stuff. And yet the way you're describing it, it sounds like we could end up with one program in Pinellas and one program in Hillsborough. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So. Well,
it may, and what may happen, for instance, right now on the Gateway project is actually going to be a static toll. It's not going to be dynamic. It's just going to be the flat rate to use it. It's not going to change by time of day. The system on the interstate is expected to be more of a dynamic tolling system. But you heard some of the folks talking about the difficulties right now with high occupancy vehicles. We'd love to be able to provide high occupancy vehicles, benefits to use the express system. But it is very difficult, and we don't have. I don't know how California Highway Patrol is, but I know they've got 4 times as many officers per capita as Florida does, and they're having a trouble probably keeping, getting out there and enforcing it. So it's an enforcement issue. Hopefully, maybe in the time period that we're looking at establishing tolls up in that area, maybe there is a technology that can identify how many people are in a vehicle. I know there's emerging technologies now that can identify the number of cell phones or perhaps a heat sensor, infrared seats. Maybe that'll be available. So our policy is going to be dynamic, and it's going to evolve with technology and also with the community. But there is a possibility that perhaps in Pinellas County, the strategy is slightly different than it is in Pinellas County, and maybe slightly different than when we get express lanes on I-4 eventually out towards Polk County. So I know what you're saying, but it could very well be differently, but we will be coordinated. I'm not sure if central office wants to add anything to that because they have a big say in our policy as well.
No, Secretary Gwen, I think that was really well said. It's got to be tailored to the regional and the community needs together, and there's a balancing that occurs. But certainly the desire to have an equitable system that is fair to all of our users and customers is important to both you and the department. Having access, having choices, and making sure that people can get where they need to go is critical to how we move forward. And that is going to create this conversation that is going to continue beyond today as we look at what the right solution is overall.
Yeah. I think you're kind of inaudible again. Sorry. Is there, I didn't mean to cut you off, just to let you know. I don't know if anybody wanted to say anything more on that.
Commissioner Kemp, I'd like to make a comment.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Secretary Gwen, for your insight on this issue. But I do believe if we consult with other organizations that have adopted an HOV toll managed lane strategy, and that it does address equity in terms of doing sort of the needs testing or the means testing. I think we could probably do this. If we're able to invest in AV as a transit solution, certainly we can invest in a tolling system that can identify how many people are in a vehicle, and then establish the toll rate based on whether or not they're an HOV or not, or identify a bus or a van or those kinds of vehicles that typically would carry more than one person. But again, enforcement costs, labor bodies. So where we can use technology to invest in that kind of infrastructure when it's determined that a toll facility is adopted on a managed lane or a segment of a road that is utilizing tolls as a way of managing congestion, I believe, that we could invest in that and get the result that we're looking for and create that equity in the conversation. We've heard a lot of great ideas about how to actually address equities. And my position is that we do have a significant population in Hillsborough County that is in dire need of assistance when we just look at the number of the shortfall we have in affordable housing, the sprawl that we have, and the needs that we have within our transit system. I think if we really look at this from a policy decision, from a point of equity, and how we utilize our, whatever tax revenues we invest in ways people get around, and prioritize an equity system, we can get there. And we've heard a lot of different ways that people have gotten there. But I do believe that it's possible if we use a combination of prioritization of investment dollars to achieve helping people get around and where those dollars go. The shared revenue that we heard from the Virginia area that suggests that toll dollars actually assist in funding transit is a great idea as a way of subsidizing our transit investments and finding ways that we can do that. So I've heard a lot of very good ideas today, and I think that we need to actively work with FDOT and our transit agency, but also in concert with our regional partners to address how we help people get around. Because one of the things I did see in your in the mapping of what's considered potentially a managed lane road is, and what I've heard from FDOT is that each facility, each managed lane road is considered for its purpose, and each one is different. So for example, the stretch between West Shore and downtown, or the stretch between Tampa and Orlando, and then we have, of course, expressways that is a separate entity. But I think it's important for us to look at the whole picture and look at how that's utilized, what neighborhoods it goes through that help facilitate getting people around, and then how we go about helping those individuals who are reliant on transit because their income levels are at a point where they can't afford a car, and that limits their access to full employment. So I'm glad we've had these conversations, and I think we really do need to make sure that they are on every single MPO agenda with recommendations to our individual county partners and transit partners on how to work with FDOT and our local funding sources to address this particular issue, because I think that will solve the problem that our citizens voted to try and solve back in 2018, even though we're sort of sitting on it. So I'll stop there. But I just wanted to make sure that we make it a priority to look at these strategies, because it not only will it solve our congestion problem, but it'll also solve our equity problem.
I think we're thinking along the same line, Commissioner Overman, and I'd love to have a further discussion with you, but I think what you're saying is very consistent with what we're looking at in our policies.
Thank you. I would say that congestion is never a problem necessarily that is solved. You can only try to address getting options for people, choices for people, so that they can get to places better. But just for Secretary Gwen, just in terms of your, and I'm very familiar and read through some of all the bus systems in the expressway transit systems in South Florida, and tried as much as I could to learn about it. I know there's multiple ones, but I think it's important for everyone to know that they just go end to end. For instance, if it went like USF to downtown, actually they go Miami-Dade with 3 stops to next Palm Beach with 3 stops. They don't stop in between as this, whatever it is that they keep throwing out there is going to do on the roadways. They are a commuter system, but while they may have increased in ridership by 300%, they're still woefully, if you compare it to the local at-grade transit routes in Miami, they're still, very untraveled, underutilized. The routes that are throughout the system are the routes that are, and that's true in communities across the country, that these long express routes are not the whole basis, and a much lesser percentage of the ridership and use. May not be true in Washington, D.C., but elsewhere in the nation, the focus on the local at grade, is really the focus that needs to be done. And I just think it's really important for us to keep looking at that. And just by driving regional rides to the local system, it would burden the local system more, because we don't make money off having ridership. Each rider costs us, but hopefully we will see all of this grind together in the future. And I don't know if we have public comment. Ms. Alden, do we have public comment?
Cheryl, is there anyone in the audience who has raised their hand and would like to speak?
We have Chris Vila.
Okay. Anyone else?
And Christopher Gleason.
Okay. 2 Chris's. Okay. So is it, I'll go to public comment now for a few minutes. And if we could have Mr. Vila.
Okay, yes. Thank you, Chair. So this was really painful to listen for the past 3 hours. I'm going to kind of step back and give you a little story about equity with TBNX and, of course, Florida. HNTB has the master contract. They're on retainer to do all these roads. There isn't another company to compete with them, right? They also have PACs. They donate money to commissioners who make decisions on MPO matters. Again, that's not equity. That's a conflict. I want to also say that we have over, probably just under 1,000 miles of toll lanes in Florida. We actually have the most toll lanes in the entire nation, and we're still in gridlock. We're still having equity issues. If you want to introduce like a transit component, it can't hurt the toll revenue. We saw this with Brightline. I read the proposal from front to back, and it said it can't hurt the toll revenue if you operate the train. So there's going to be a certain hierarchy and competition between the systems that are completely unfair because of debt, because we are credit card charging these highway systems. One important thing I want to bring up is that the express lanes is going through our CRA. Now, if you look at the SEIS report, if you read the whole thing like I did, FDOT doesn't know the local impacts to the community. They really don't. They don't have the software for it. Also, they're banking on making revenue on this road down the future when CRAs expire. You understand what's going on here? So nothing will really matter. FDOT will have the leeway. And before I wrap up, I'm really getting tired of everybody giving FDOT a second chance, a third chance. I understand there's some diplomacy going on here. You have to realize they were given $35 million to study this project. And they were supposed to come back to the table in 2 months. It took them well over 2 years to get it right. And we still have an incomplete report on equity and civil rights matters. So I'm tired of all these games. I'm tired of you guys playing diplomatic here. Do your jobs. I voted you for. Do your jobs and take care of this matter. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Gleason? Are you there, Chris Gleason?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, I would like to speak. I spent 2 hours yesterday with the MPO CAC listening to presentations and 3 hours today. And it really upsets me that yesterday the speaker was from Canada. They can't fathom how backwards Florida is. And I understand that where he's coming from is a great thing, but it's all theoretical. And what I heard today is all theoretical utopian situations. And that's not reality of Florida. Unfortunately, it's not. And we have to be more, especially when you're doing presentations, you get experts. They have to know the situation in our state, in our city, especially with our surtax that's been held up for over a year by the state. All the stuff that we're talking about for a large part is all dependent on having money to do it. If there's no money to do things, it doesn't matter what you say. If the money isn't there to do it, you can't do it. I've been following transportation for a very long time, beginning with TBX and now TB Next. And I have to say that what I've seen is the state FDOT has bent a little bit when it comes to funding transit, which is great. But I am in the belief a lot of people on the CAC and some people on this board that the main reason I think they're pushing this is justification to add lanes to a already messed up road, elevated highway that goes through our urban core. And my belief is that having a elevated bus or having a bus route on elevated roadway doesn't do much good for anybody outside of each end of that route. The money could be spent way better ways, and I'm not an expert. I'm not telling you I have a better plan, but I just believe that for the amount of money that we're going to spend for a glorified express bus, it doesn't make sense to me. And I hope that the board will continue to do their work and continue to have real solutions to citizens of Hillsborough County. UMPO is responsible to the citizens of Hillsborough County, not to Pasco County and not Pinellas County. And I hope you keep that in consideration when you vote in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. So there's no one else, correct, Ms. Alden?
No, there are no other.
Okay. Okay. So I think it's a few minutes after noon. It was a long day. Thank you to all the speakers. Oh, did you have some announcements as well to make? No, I guess just adding that to the agenda there. And thank you to all the speakers for being part of this. It was very enlightening and we heard a lot. So thank you very much, Ms. Alden, for putting it together. Thank you, Secretary Gwen, and FDOT representatives for coming forward.
We will bring this back for further board discussion. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks.